The moment Abigail Harper's papers hit the dirt, she knew they'd won, or so they thought. Surrounded by laughing faces and the scorching heat of Willow Bend's main street, the woman who dared teach poor wives to read their own account books was finally getting what the powerful folks said she deserved. But as her trembling fingers gathered each scattered page from the dust, something harder than shame settled in her chest. She wasn't broken. She was furious. And before this summer ended, every person who'd thrown her out would learn exactly what happened when you tried to bury a woman who refused to stay down. If you want to see how one woman brought an entire corrupt town to its knees, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The heat in Willow Bend that July afternoon could crack leather and human patience in equal measure. Abigail Harper had lived through 4 frontier summers by then, but this one felt different, meaner somehow, like the sun itself had taken sides against her. She sat at the narrow desk in her boarding room, finishing the last entries in Martha Reed's household ledger. The numbers didn't lie, even when people desperately wanted them to. 3 years of overcharges at Doyle's General Store. Small amounts, carefully scattered across different months, but they added up to nearly $40, more than Martha's late husband had earned in 2 months of hard work. "You're certain?" Martha's voice shook as she traced the column with one weathered finger. The widow was 43 but looked 60, worn down by grief and struggling to keep her small farm running alone. "I'm certain." Abigail kept her voice steady, though anger burned in her gut. "They've been adding extra charges to your account for years. A few cents here, $1 there, betting you couldn't read well enough to notice." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but not the defeated kind. These were hot, righteous tears. "My Henry worked himself to death trying to pay our debts, and all along, you weren't the only one." Abigail closed the ledger carefully. "I found the same pattern in 11 other accounts. Always widows or wives whose husbands work away from town, always small enough that you'd think you just remembered wrong." "What do I do?" "Confront them, show them the numbers, demand your money back." Abigail met Martha's eyes. "And keep learning to read. That's the only way they can't do this again." After Martha left, walking straighter than she had in months, Abigail allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. This was why she'd started the reading lessons 6 weeks ago, teaching women in the back room of the old Carver Street building every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Not just letters and Bible verses like the church ladies offered, but practical arithmetic, how to read contracts, how to check store accounts and mortgage terms. The powerful men of Willow Bend hadn't liked it, but she'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the cold, calculating opposition from the women at the top of the social ladder. Margaret Doyle, wife of the general store owner and the closest thing Willow Bend had to aristocracy, had made her disapproval clear from the start. At the church social 3 weeks back, she'd cornered Abigail near the punch bowl with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Harper, I hear you've been holding educational gatherings for some of our less fortunate ladies. Teaching them to read their account books, yes. How charitable." Margaret's tone could have frozen whiskey. "Though I do wonder if you're truly qualified. You're not a certified teacher, after all, just a ledger keeper who works for Mr. Patterson at the lumber office. I can read and cipher. That's all they need to learn. Still, one must be careful about putting ideas into simple heads. These women have been managing their households just fine without—" "Have they?" Abigail had made herself smile. "Because the numbers suggest otherwise." Margaret's expression had gone cold as January. "Be careful, Miss Harper. Willow Bend is a small town. Reputations are fragile things." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, the pressure had been building like a thunderhead on the horizon. 2 of her students stopped coming after their husbands suddenly forbade it. The owner of the Carver Street building informed her she could no longer use the space. His wife had concerns about the propriety of the gatherings. Even Mr. Patterson had called her into his office with an uncomfortable expression. "Abigail, you're the best bookkeeper I've ever employed. Your work is flawless, but I'm getting pressure from some influential people to let you go." "Let me guess. The Doyles?" Patterson had looked miserable. "Among others. They're saying you're causing trouble, spreading discord among the women, making accusations. I'm teaching people to read their own accounts. If that causes discord, maybe the discord was already there, just hidden. I agree with you, I do, but I have to think of my business." He'd paused, struggling with himself. I can keep you on for now, but please, be careful. These people don't play fair when they feel threatened. Now, sitting in her boarding room as the afternoon heat pressed against the windows, Abigail wondered if she'd been careful enough. Probably not. Careful wasn't in her nature, never had been. She'd grown up in St. Louis, the youngest daughter of a printer who taught all his children to read and cipher, regardless of their sex. When her father died and her older brothers inherited the business, Abigail had headed west with $15 and her father's old account books, determined to make her own way. She'd worked as a ledger keeper in 3 different frontier towns before settling in Willow Bend, and she'd never been the type to keep her head down and her mouth shut. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Donnelly, the boarding house owner, stood in the hallway, her usually friendly face tight with discomfort. Miss Harper, I need to speak with you. Abigail's stomach dropped. Come in. No, Mrs. Donnelly twisted her hands together. I'm afraid I need to ask you to leave. Today. Today? I'm sorry, truly I am. But I've been informed that housing you reflects poorly on the moral character of my establishment. The older woman's voice cracked. My son's wife is friends with Elizabeth Doyle, and she said if I don't put you out, they'll make sure the church ladies stop recommending my rooms to visitors. I can't afford to lose that business. Abigail felt her face go hot, then cold. Mrs. Donnelly, I've paid through the end of the month. I'll refund the difference. Please, Miss Harper, pack your things and go quietly. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder for who? But Mrs. Donnelly had already turned away, almost fleeing down the hall. Abigail stood frozen for a moment, fury and humiliation warring in her chest. Then she moved mechanically, pulling her trunk from under the bed, folding her spare dresses, wrapping her books and papers. Everything she owned fit into one medium-sized trunk and a carpet bag. 4 years of frontier life, and she could still pack up and disappear in less than an hour. The thought made her want to scream. She was carrying her trunk down the narrow stairs when she heard the voices from the front parlor. Several women, their tones excited and vicious in that particular way that meant gossip was being savored like expensive candy. Us, completely inappropriate, teaching those women to question their betters. I heard she's been telling them the stores are cheating them, as if Margaret Doyle would ever. Probably bitter, because no decent man would have her. Too sharp-tongued and mannish, Abigail's hands tightened on the trunk handle. She could confront them, could walk into that parlor and lay out exactly what she'd discovered. But what would it accomplish? They'd already decided who she was. She made it to the front door before Mrs. Donnelly appeared again, looking even more uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Miss Harper, but Mrs. Doyle is waiting outside. She insisted on being present when you left, to ensure, she said, that there was no disturbance. Of course she is. Abigail pushed through the door into the brutal afternoon sun. Margaret Doyle stood on the wooden sidewalk across the street, flanked by 3 other well-dressed women. A small crowd had gathered. Apparently someone had spread the word that there would be entertainment today. Abigail recognized several faces: shopkeepers, laborers, a few of the men from the lumber office. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, but none of them met her eyes. Miss Harper, Margaret's voice carried across the dusty street. How unfortunate that your accommodation situation has changed. Perhaps you'll find the next town more suited to your particular temperament. Abigail said nothing, just started across the street toward the livery stable where she could store her trunk while she figured out her next move. That's when her carpet bag slipped. She'd been gripping it too tightly, her palms slick with sweat and anger, and the handle twisted out of her grasp. The bag hit the dirt and burst open, scattering papers and books across the rutted street. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone laughed, high and cruel. Someone else joined in. Within seconds, the laughter spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Abigail stood frozen, staring at her scattered possessions. Her father's old accounting textbook lying spine up in the dust. The careful records she'd been keeping of the overcharges. Her personal letters. Her certificate of arithmetic proficiency from the St. Louis Commercial Academy. Everything that proved she was educated, competent, worth something. All of it lying in the dirt like trash while the town laughed. Oh dear, Margaret Doyle's voice dripped false sympathy. How clumsy! But then women who spend too much time with books and numbers often lose their feminine grace, don't they? More laughter. Someone made a comment about dried-up spinsters. Someone else suggested that this was what happened when women got above their station. Abigail's vision blurred with tears she absolutely refused to shed. Not here, not in front of them. She dropped to her knees in the dust and started gathering papers with shaking hands. "Need help, Miss Harper?" A young man's voice, mocking. "Or are you too independent to accept assistance from a mere man?" She didn't look up, just kept gathering papers. Her fingers found the ledger where she'd documented Martha Reed's overcharges. A boot scraped the dirt near her hand, someone standing too close, deliberately invading her space. Maybe this is a lesson. Margaret Doyle's shadow fell across her. Some women aren't meant for certain kinds of work. They should stick to what nature intended. "Ma'am, you're blocking my light." The voice came from behind Abigail, quiet but carrying an edge that cut through the laughter like a knife through butter. Abigail looked up. A man stood between her and Margaret Doyle's group. Tall, weathered, maybe 35, with the kind of face that had spent too much time in the sun and wind to be called handsome, but held something steady and solid that made you pay attention anyway. He wore dusty range clothes and a battered hat, and he was looking at Margaret Doyle with an expression of polite contempt that seemed to puzzle her. "Excuse me?" Margaret's tone turned icy. "You're blocking the lady's light," he gestured at Abigail. "She's trying to gather her belongings, and you're standing there casting shadows and running your mouth. So either help or step back." The crowd went silent. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Margaret began. "Caleb Boone. I run a horse ranch about 12 miles north." He turned away from her dismissively and crouched next to Abigail, starting to gather papers without asking permission. "These go together?" Abigail stared at him, her brain struggling to process this development. "Yes. Thank you." "No problem." His hands were careful with her papers, not crumpling or rushing. "You got somewhere to take this stuff?" "The livery. I was going to—" "I'll help you carry it." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Abigail took it, letting him pull her to her feet. The crowd was still silent, watching the stranger disrupt their entertainment. Margaret Doyle had regrouped. "Mr. Boone, I'm not sure you understand the situation here. Miss Harper has been causing considerable trouble in our town, making false accusations against respectable citizens." "Don't care." Caleb picked up Abigail's carpet bag, checking that everything was secured. "Not my business what disputes you folks have, but watching a woman get humiliated in the street while people laugh, that I care about. She brought this on herself." "Did she drop that bag on purpose? To amuse you?" Caleb's tone stayed level, but something in it made Margaret step back. "Because from where I stood it looked like an accident, and instead of helping, you all decided to make a show of it." He turned to Abigail. "You ready?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked through the silent crowd together, Caleb carrying her bag while she clutched her trunk and her gathered papers. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed now. At the livery, Caleb helped her stow her trunk in the tack room where old Tom Bradley agreed to keep it for 50 cents. Then he turned to her with a directness that was somehow easier to handle than sympathy would have been. "What's your plan?" Abigail took a shaky breath. "Leave town, I suppose. Find work somewhere else." "Where?" "I don't know. Silver Creek, maybe. Or I could go back east. Silver Creek's 4 days' ride through territory that's seen 3 stagecoach robberies in the last month. You got money for an escort?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying her face in a way that felt assessing rather than judgmental. "That woman back there, Doyle, what did you do to get on her bad side?" "Taught some women to read their account books. Helped them see they'd been overcharged for years. At her husband's store, among other places. And they pushed you out for it." It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. "Yes." Caleb nodded slowly, like something had just confirmed itself in his mind. "You planning to go quietly?" "What choice do I have?" "You could fight. Expose what you found." Abigail laughed bitterly. "To who? Half the powerful people in this town are probably in on it. The sheriff's married to Margaret Doyle's cousin. The judge plays cards with her husband every Friday night. And I'm just a ledger keeper who can't even keep a room at a boarding house. So you're just going to let them win? The question hit harder than it should have. Abigail felt fresh tears threatening and pushed them back furiously. What else can I do? I'm alone here. I have no family, no powerful friends, no way to fight people who control everything from the stores to the courts to the church. You're not alone right now. She looked at him. You don't even know me. Know enough. Saw you on your knees in the dirt, picking up your papers while people laughed. Saw you keep your spine straight and your voice steady. He paused. Also saw what was written on some of those papers. Account discrepancies, systematically recorded. That's not the work of someone making trouble for fun. That's the work of someone who found something real. It doesn't matter what I found if no one will listen. Someone will listen. Just got to get the information to the right person. Caleb adjusted his hat against the afternoon glare. But first you got to stay alive and free long enough to do it. Which brings me back to my original question. What's your plan? I told you, leave town, find work. On your own? Through dangerous country? With however much money you've got left after they pushed you out early? He shook his head. Bad plan. You have a better one? Matter of fact, I do. You let me escort you to Silver Creek. I know the safe routes and I'm headed that direction anyway to pick up some breeding stock. You can figure out your next move from there, somewhere these people can't reach you. Abigail stared at him. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do. He said it simply, like there was no other possible answer, and because I got a feeling you're the kind of person worth helping. Before Abigail could respond, rapid footsteps approached. She turned to see Eleanor Tate, one of her students, hurrying into the livery with her face flushed from running. Miss Harper, thank heaven I found you. Eleanor clutched a folded paper to her chest, breathing hard. I was coming to your lesson tonight and heard what happened at the boarding house. Then June Bell told me about what they did in the street, and She stopped, seeming to notice Caleb for the first time. It's all right, Abigail said. Eleanor, this is Mr. Boone. He's helping me. Mr. Boone, Eleanor Tate, one of my students. Eleanor nodded distractedly. Miss Harper, you can't leave. Not yet. Not without seeing this. She thrust the paper forward. My husband works at the courthouse. He was supposed to burn these old records in the furnace, but when I asked him to let me practice my reading on them first, I found, well, you need to see this. Abigail unfolded the paper. It was a property transfer document dated 3 years earlier. She scanned it quickly, her pulse starting to race. The Martinez family farm, 40 acres of good bottomland, transferred to Margaret Doyle for settlement of debts owed. The amount listed made Abigail's breath catch. $1,500. An astronomical sum that no small farming family could possibly owe the general store. Eleanor, where did this debt supposedly come from? That's what I thought was strange. So I asked my husband if there were other records, and he found 2 more from around the same time. Eleanor's voice shook with excitement and fear. The Chen family's equipment sold to settle $800 in store debt. The Kowalski widow's house plot transferred for $600 owed. Abigail's mind raced. She'd reviewed the Kowalski account just last week while teaching the woman's daughter to read. There had been charges, yes, but nowhere near $600. Maybe $150 at most. These are all families where the husband died or left town, she said slowly. And all families where no one could read the documents they were signing. Eleanor's eyes were bright with angry tears. My husband didn't think anything of it at the time. He just filed what they gave him. But when I started to read them myself... Caleb had been quiet, but now he spoke. How many properties has this Doyle woman acquired this way? My husband thinks at least 7 over the past 5 years. Maybe more if you go back further. Abigail sat down hard on a hay bale, the implications crashing over her. This wasn't just petty overcharging. This was systematic fraud, using falsified debt records to essentially steal land and property from vulnerable people who couldn't read the documents being shoved in front of them. She's been building an empire, she whispered. While everyone thinks she's just the respectable general store owner's wife, she's been quietly taking over half the property in the county. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked. Before Abigail could answer, Caleb interjected. Question is, what are you going to do? He looked at Eleanor. You brought this to Miss Harper. Are you willing to testify to where you got it? To what your husband found? Eleanor went pale. My husband could lose his position. We have 3 children. I understand. Abigail put a hand on the younger woman's arm. You've done enough. This is my fight now. No. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. No, you taught me to read so I could stop being helpless, so I could understand when something wrong was happening. Well, something wrong is happening, and if I stay quiet about it, then what was the point of learning? Your family will be fine. My husband is good at his work and there are other courthouses. But how many more families will Margaret Doyle destroy if nobody stops her? Eleanor's voice firmed up. I'll testify. Whatever you need. Abigail felt something shift in her chest, fear transforming into something harder and cleaner. Purpose. She looked at Caleb. I'm not leaving town. He didn't look surprised. Figured you might say that. This is bigger than I thought, and if I run now, she wins. They all win, and they'll just keep doing this to the next woman who tries to speak up. They'll come after you hard if you stay. They already did. How much worse can it get? Caleb's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. Lot worse, actually, but I appreciate the spirit. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. You can't stay in town. They'll make sure you can't rent a room anywhere, and camping in the street won't help your case. But my ranch is far enough out that Doyle's reach doesn't extend there. You could stay in the foreman's cabin. It's empty right now since I'm between hired men. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. He met her eyes steadily. Something you said before stuck with me about being alone. Well, maybe you don't have to be. And maybe I'm tired of watching powerful people crush everyone in their path while good folks stand by and do nothing. Abigail felt her throat tighten. After hours of humiliation and rejection, this stranger's simple decency hit her like a physical force. Why are you doing this? Told you already. It's right. He paused. Also, my mother was cheated out of her inheritance by a smooth-talking lawyer when my father died. She couldn't read the contract she signed, and by the time I was old enough to understand what had happened, it was too late to fight it. She died thinking she'd failed us, when really she'd been robbed by someone who knew she was vulnerable. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Help me make sure it doesn't keep happening to other people. He turned to Eleanor. Can your husband get more records? Anything that shows the pattern? I can ask, but he has to be careful. Understood. Tell him to copy what he can, but not to risk his position. We only get one shot at this, so we need to be smart. Over the next hour, huddled in the livery office while old Tom kept watch, they formed a plan. Eleanor would have her husband quietly copy any relevant property transfers and debt records he could access. Abigail would reach out to the other women she'd taught, see who might be willing to testify about overcharges or suspicious debts. And Caleb would ride to Silver Creek to contact the territorial marshal's office, because if the local law was compromised, they needed to go higher. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Eleanor left first, walking out casually like she'd just been checking on a horse. 15 minutes later, Caleb and Abigail followed, loading her trunk onto his wagon and heading out of town on the North Road. Abigail looked back once at Willow Bend, at the buildings turning golden in the evening light. The town that had just publicly humiliated her. The town she was now planning to return to with evidence that could destroy its most powerful woman. You're sure about this? Caleb asked quietly, watching her face. No, Abigail admitted, but I'm sure about what happens if I do nothing, and I can't live with that. He nodded and snapped the reins, urging the horses forward. Neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadow of the feed store, a young man in the Doyles' employ, who'd been sent to make sure the troublesome ledger keeper actually left town. By the time the wagon was out of sight, he was already running back to the general store with news that would make Margaret Doyle very, very angry indeed. The war for Willow Bend had begun. The Boone Ranch sat in a shallow valley where cottonwoods clustered along a creek that ran year-round, even in the brutal summer months. Abigail had expected something rough, a bachelor's quarters with dirt floors and unwashed dishes. What she found instead was a well-maintained spread with a sturdy main house, a barn that didn't sag, and fences that actually looked like they could hold horses instead of just suggesting where horses ought to stay. The foreman's cabin was small but solid, with a real wood floor and a stove that didn't smoke too badly. Caleb carried her trunk inside without ceremony, set it by the narrow bed, and pointed out where she could find water and firewood. "Lock works," he said, demonstrating the bolt on the door. Nobody comes out here except me, and occasionally my hand, Jesse, but he's in Silver Creek picking up supplies and won't be back for a week. This is too much. It's an empty cabin. You staying in it doesn't cost me anything. He moved toward the door, then paused. You know how to shoot? The question caught her off guard. A rifle, yes. My father taught me, but I don't have one. Caleb disappeared and returned a minute later with a Winchester and a box of ammunition. Keep it loaded. You see anyone coming who's not me and you don't feel right about it, shoot first and apologize never. You think they'd follow me out here? I think Margaret Doyle just got embarrassed in front of half the town, and people like that don't forget. He met her eyes. You kicked a hornet's nest, Miss Harper. Hornets tend to swarm. After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed and let herself shake. The adrenaline that had carried her through the afternoon was draining away, leaving behind exhaustion and a fear she hadn't let herself feel while people were watching. She'd made herself a target, not just for social disapproval or lost employment, but for something potentially dangerous. People who systematically defrauded widows and stole property weren't going to respond to exposure with gracious apologies, but the alternative was running. And she'd spent too many years watching injustice happen while good people stayed silent, because speaking up was risky. She loaded the Winchester with hands that only trembled a little. The next morning, Caleb knocked just after dawn. When Abigail opened the door, he handed her a tin cup of coffee and a wrapped bundle that turned out to be biscuits and bacon. Thought you might not have supplies yet. Thank you. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and she was grateful. You didn't have to… Seems like you're determined to say that about everything I do. He leaned against the porch rail, his own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. I'm riding to Silver Creek today. You need me to send any messages? Let anyone know where you are? Abigail thought about it. My students, they'll worry when I don't show up for Tuesday's lesson. You trust them to keep quiet about where you've gone? Most of them, but information spreads, especially when someone's looking hard for it. Then maybe best to let them worry for now. Once we have the marshal involved, you can send word. He drained his cup. I should be back in 3 days, 4 at most. You'll be all right here alone? I've been alone before. Not the same as being alone with people actively hunting for you. The bluntness of it made her stomach clench, but she appreciated that he didn't soften it. I'll be fine. I have the rifle. Use it if you need to. He straightened up. One more thing. You said you found overcharge patterns in 11 accounts. You have documentation of all that? In my trunk, copies of the relevant ledger pages, notes on the discrepancies. Keep it hidden. Bury it if you have to. That's your ammunition, and if they find it before you can use it, you've got nothing. After he rode out, Abigail spent the morning organizing her evidence. She'd been meticulous in her record-keeping, but looking at it now with fresh eyes, she realized how incomplete it was. She had proof of overcharges at the general store and 2 other shops. She had Eleanor's property transfer documents showing the pattern of land acquisition. But what she didn't have was the connecting tissue, proof that Margaret Doyle had personally orchestrated it all, rather than just benefiting from her husband's questionable business practices. She was staring at the papers spread across the cabin's small table when she heard horses approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed the Winchester, moving to the window where she could see without being easily seen. 2 riders. Both women. One of them riding side saddle in a way that suggested more determination than skill. Abigail recognized them both. Martha Reed, the widow whose accounts she'd been reviewing, and June Bell, a younger woman whose husband worked on the railroad, gone for weeks at a time while June struggled to manage their household and 2 small children on whatever money he sent back. She opened the door as they dismounted, keeping the rifle visible but lowered. How did you find me? Martha looked embarrassed. Tom Bradley at the livery. He said you'd gone north with Caleb Boone, and there's only one place north of town with decent water this time of year. Also, we bribed him with pie, June added. She looked around nervously. Are we safe here? Safer than in town. Come inside. Over more coffee, Abigail was starting to understand why Caleb made it so strong. The 2 women explained why they'd come. After what happened yesterday, people are talking, Martha said. Some folks think you got what you deserved for stirring up trouble, but others are starting to ask questions about why teaching women to read their own accounts was such a threat. about what exactly you might have found that made the Doyles so angry. And we're not the only ones who've been overcharged, June cut in. Her hands were wrapped tight around her coffee cup, knuckles white. Sarah Mendez came to me this morning. Her husband died in a mining accident 2 years ago, and she's been barely holding on, taking in washing to keep her children fed. She said the mercantile's been charging her for items she never bought. When she tried to question it, they told her she must have forgotten, and that maybe if she can't keep track of her purchases, she shouldn't be managing her own account. How much? Abigail asked. $3 a month for 6 months. Doesn't sound like much, but for her, it's the difference between eating and not eating. Abigail felt the familiar anger rising. Is she willing to testify? She's terrified, but she's also desperate. If someone official would actually listen, actually investigate. That's what we're working on. Caleb's gone to contact the territorial marshal. Martha and June exchanged glances. That's actually why we came, Martha said, to warn you. This morning, Sheriff Crawford went to every business in town asking if anyone had seen you. Said you'd stolen property from the Doyles and run off. Abigail went cold. What property? They claim you took account books from the general store. Books that supposedly prove you made up the overcharges to cover your own theft. That's a lie. I never took anything from... She stopped, remembering. Wait. I made copies. From memory and from information my students brought me, but I never took their actual books. Doesn't matter what's true if everyone believes the lie, June said quietly. They're saying you were fired from your position at the lumber office for discrepancies in the accounts. That you needed money and tried to blackmail the Doyles by threatening to spread false rumors about their business practices. Patterson didn't fire me. He did yesterday afternoon. Said he received evidence of irregularities in the lumber office books and had no choice. Martha's face was grim. Margaret Doyle presented the evidence personally. She's very thorough. Abigail sat down hard. This was worse than she'd expected. Margaret wasn't just defending herself. She was actively destroying Abigail's credibility, making sure that if any accusations did surface, they'd look like the desperate lies of a thief trying to deflect blame. There's more, June said. They're planning to petition the territorial governor to issue a warrant for your arrest. They want you brought back to face charges. How do you know that? My cousin works for the judge. She said Margaret Doyle was in his office this morning with her husband and 2 other men. They were talking about how to handle the situation before it damaged their reputations. Before I damaged their reputations, you mean? That's why we came, Martha said. To tell you that you need to run. Really run this time. Not just to the next town, but somewhere they can't reach you. Go east, go to California, but get far away before they make this official. Abigail looked at the 2 women who'd risked coming out here to warn her. Both of them were victims of the same system that was now trying to crush her. Both of them had more to lose than she did. Martha had her farm, small as it was, and June had her children. I'm not running. Miss Harper, if I run, I look guilty, and guilty people don't get marshals to investigate their claims. They get arrested and brought back in chains. She stood up, her mind working fast. Besides, we have something they don't know about. Those property transfer documents Eleanor found. That's not something I could have faked or stolen. That's official courthouse record showing a pattern of fraud. But if they issue a warrant before the marshal can investigate, then we make sure the marshal gets the evidence first. Abigail started gathering her papers. Caleb's been gone one day. If he pushes hard, he can reach Silver Creek by tomorrow evening. If I can get this documentation to him before they realize I'm trying, he can hand it directly to the marshal. How are you going to get it to him? June asked. You can't ride into Silver Creek yourself. If there's a warrant out, they'll arrest you on sight. No, but you could take it, both of you. 2 women traveling together to visit relatives in Silver Creek. Nothing suspicious about that. Martha shook her head. We can't. I have the farm. Your neighbor boy, the Peterson kid, he helps out sometimes, doesn't he? And June, your sister lives 2 streets over from you. Between the 2 of them, they can manage for a few days. It's not that simple. Nothing about this is simple. Abigail's voice rose, frustration boiling over. They're going to keep doing this. To you, to Sarah Mendez, to every woman in this territory who can't read well enough to defend herself. They're building wealth and power on the backs of widows and struggling families. and they're doing it because they know we're too scared or too isolated to fight back. The silence that followed was heavy with fear and anger in equal measure. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If we do this, if we help you, and it doesn't work, we'll lose everything. Our homes, our reputations, they'll make sure we can't survive in Willow Bend. I know. And you're asking us to risk it anyway. I'm asking you to decide what you can live with. Abigail met their eyes. I can live with losing my job and my reputation. What I can't live with is knowing I ran away when I had evidence that could stop this. That somewhere down the line, another woman got cheated, got robbed, got driven to desperation, and I could have prevented it, but didn't because it was too risky. June spoke up, her voice stronger than before. My husband sends home $20 a month from the railroad. By the time it gets to me and I pay what the mercantile says I owe, I have $6 left to feed my children and keep a roof over our heads. I've been telling myself I must be doing something wrong, managing the money poorly. But I'm not, am I? They're just taking it. Probably. Then I'm tired of being too scared to call it what it is, theft. She looked at Martha. What about you? Martha was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. My Henry worked himself to death paying debts we apparently never actually owed. I watched him break his body trying to be a good man, a good provider. And all that time, they were robbing us blind and laughing about how we were too stupid to notice. Her jaw tightened. I'll take your papers to Silver Creek, and if they come after me for it, at least I'll go down fighting instead of just taking what they give me and pretending it's fair. Relief and guilt washed through Abigail in equal measure. Thank you. Don't thank us yet. We might all end up in jail before this is over. But Martha was already standing, brushing down her skirt with determined hands. When do we leave? They planned it carefully. Martha and June would return to town separately, make their arrangements, and leave the next morning on the eastbound stage that passed through Willow Bend twice a week. Nothing unusual about two women traveling to visit family. They'd get off at Crestview, the halfway point, rent horses, and ride the rest of the way to Silver Creek through back trails that June's husband had told her about. Less chance of running into anyone who might report their movements back to Willow Bend. Abigail spent the afternoon preparing a complete packet of evidence, copies of the account discrepancies, Eleanor's property transfer documents, a detailed written statement explaining the pattern she'd discovered, and a list of women who might be willing to testify if the marshal provided protection. As the sun started to sink, she walked Martha and June back to their horses. Be careful, she said. If anyone asks where you've been, visiting a sick friend north of town, Martha said. Already decided on the story. We'll stick to it. They were mounted and ready to leave when June turned back. Miss Harper, what you said yesterday about teaching us to read so we wouldn't be helpless anymore, I just want you to know it worked. Still scared, terrified actually, but I'm not helpless, and that's worth fighting for. Abigail watched them ride away, two ordinary women heading back into danger because she'd convinced them they had power they hadn't known they possessed. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside the cabin made her reach for the rifle. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves could be someone coming for her. When dawn finally came, she was exhausted but wired, too anxious to eat the biscuits she'd saved from yesterday. She spent the morning pacing, then forcing herself to sit still, then pacing again. Around midday, she heard a horse approaching. She grabbed the Winchester, heart pounding, and positioned herself by the window. The rider was Caleb. He was back 2 days early, riding hard, and the look on his face when he dismounted told her something had gone very wrong. She met him at the door. What happened? The marshal's dead. Caleb's voice was flat, exhausted. Killed 3 days ago in Silver Creek, shot in the back outside his office. Abigail felt the floor tilt under her. What? They're calling it a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was taken, his office ransacked. Caleb pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. But the deputy I talked to, young kid, seemed nervous as hell. He said something didn't sit right. Said the marshal had been working on something big, something involving land fraud in multiple counties. And the day before he died, he'd received a telegram from someone warning him off, telling him to drop the investigation or face consequences. Do they know who sent it? No, but the timing's interesting, isn't it? Right when we were about to bring him evidence of exactly the kind of fraud he was investigating. Abigail's mind raced. You think Margaret Doyle? I think somebody wanted that marshal dead before he could dig any deeper. Whether that's Doyle or someone she's connected to, I don't know. But it means we've got a bigger problem than we thought. The deputy, can he help us? He's scared, said his boss told him to rule it a robbery and close the case. When I pushed, he basically told me to leave town before I got myself killed too. Caleb looked at her directly. We're on our own here, Abigail. She sank onto the porch step, the implications crashing over her. No marshal, no federal authority to take their evidence to. Just them against a network of corruption that apparently reached far enough to kill a territorial officer who got too close. Martha and June, she said suddenly, they're on their way to Silver Creek with the evidence. We have to warn them. Can't. They'll be halfway there by now, and I don't know which route they took. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his sun-warmed shirt. But maybe that's not the worst thing. They're still going to find a deputy there, even if the marshal's dead. And if that deputy has any sense, he'll realize that two women showing up with detailed evidence of fraud right after his boss was killed for investigating fraud. That's not a coincidence. Or he'll think we're trying to distract from the real criminals by making up stories about respectable citizens. Maybe. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You know what this means, though? If the marshal was killed for getting too close, it means what you found is real. It means you're right. That's not as comforting as it should be. No. But it means we can't back down now. Because if they're willing to kill a federal marshal, they'll definitely kill you if they get the chance. Your only protection is making this public enough that killing you would raise more questions than it answers. Abigail looked at him. You're talking about going back to Willowbend. I'm talking about doing what you said you were going to do. Exposing them. Forcing this into the open where they can't make it disappear quietly. How? The local law is compromised, the federal authority is dead, and I'm about to have a warrant out for my arrest on theft charges. Then we make them issue that warrant in public, in front of witnesses who can see exactly what's happening and why. He turned to face her fully. They want you to run or hide, want to discredit you before anyone hears your side. So instead, you walk right back into town, demand a public hearing on the charges, and present your evidence where everyone can see it. That's insane. Probably, but I don't see another play. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing crop rotation instead of a plan that could get them both killed. You show up with documentation, with testimony from victims, with official property records that prove the pattern. You make them defend themselves in public instead of in back rooms and private offices. Some people will take their side. Margaret Doyle's built up a lot of loyalty. But some people will listen. And all you need is enough doubt, enough questions, that they can't just sweep this away. Boss, Abigail wanted to argue, to point out the 1,000 ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But the truth was, Caleb was right. Running would confirm every lie they'd told about her. Hiding would just give them time to solidify their story and erase more evidence. The only move she had left was the one they weren't expecting. When? She asked. Tomorrow. Sunday. They'll be at services, the whole town gathered in one place. You show up before the sermon, demand to be heard. Make them deal with you in front of everyone. The church, Abigail said slowly. Margaret Doyle's territory. She's been on the church council for years. Which means if you can make your case there, on her home ground, it'll hit that much harder. He paused. I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. If they decide to arrest you on the spot, claim you're disturbed or violent, I can't stop a whole church full of people. But I can stand with you, testify to what I saw that day in the street. And I can make damn sure they know that if anything happens to you, I'll make noise loud enough that the territorial governor will have to take notice. You do that? Risk your ranch, your reputation? My reputation's built on breeding good horses and keeping my word. Neither of those things requires me to stand by while people get crushed. He stood up, offered her his hand. So what do you say, Miss Harper? You ready to kick another hornet's nest? She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, on one condition. What's that? Stop calling me Miss Harper. If we're going to war together, you might as well use my name. For the first time since he'd ridden up, Caleb smiled. All right then, Abigail. Let's go make some trouble. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Abigail organized her evidence into a clear, presentable order. documentation that could be easily understood even by people who didn't want to understand it. Caleb cleaned and loaded 2 more rifles, plus his revolver, not because he expected a gunfight in church, but because, as he put it, expecting the best while preparing for the worst had kept him alive this long. As evening fell, Abigail found herself unable to sit still. She kept rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd present the evidence, anticipating objections and preparing responses. Caleb finally got tired of watching her wear a path in the cabin floor. "Come on, you need to clear your head, or you'll be useless tomorrow." He led her down to the creek where his horses grazed in the evening cool. A dozen animals, all solid stock with good lines, moving peacefully through the long grass. "This is what I built," he said quietly, leaning on the fence. "After my mother died and I realized nobody was going to give me anything, I started with 1 horse and a dream of having a place that was mine. It took me 8 years to get here. 8 years of brutal work and going without and making choices nobody should have to make." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow you're going to walk into that church and people are going to look at you like you're dirt, like you've got no right to stand up and speak, like everything they've built gives them the authority to crush you." He turned to look at her. "But I've watched you these last few days. Watched you refuse to break when they humiliated you in the street. Watched you turn around and ride toward danger instead of away from it. That takes strength most people don't have, including most of the people who will be sitting in that church." "I'm terrified," Abigail admitted. "Good. Means you're not stupid." He paused. "But don't let them see it. Don't give them the satisfaction of knowing they got to you." They stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was answered by another. The horses moved peacefully through the darkening grass, untroubled by human complications. "Caleb," Abigail said quietly, "why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's just about your mother." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest in a way that made her chest tighten. "Because when I rode into Willow Bend that day and saw you on your knees picking up papers while people laughed, I saw something I recognized. That moment when you realize the world isn't fair and nobody's coming to save you. That moment when you have to decide if you're going to surrender or fight, even though fighting might destroy you." He turned to face her. "And I watched you make your choice, watched you keep your spine straight and your hands steady. And I thought, that's the kind of person worth standing beside. Tim, even if standing beside me costs you everything? I've built this place once. If I have to, I can build it again." His smile was crooked, genuine. "But I'd rather build a world where women like you don't get crushed for having the audacity to be smart and brave. Seems like a better use of my time." Abigail felt tears threatening and forced them back. Tomorrow she'd need to be hard, unbreakable. Tonight, just for a moment, she let herself feel the gratitude and relief of not being alone. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank me after we survive tomorrow." They walked back to the cabin in the darkness, and Caleb didn't leave until he'd checked the locks, the rifle, and made sure she had water and food enough for the morning. "Get some sleep," he said at the door. "I'll be here before dawn. We ride in together." After he left, Abigail tried to follow his advice, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept seeing tomorrow play out in a dozen different ways, most of them ending with her in jail, or worse. But underneath the fear was something else, a hard, bright anger that had been building since the moment her carpet bag hit the dirt and the crowd started laughing. They'd tried to break her, tried to make her small and ashamed and silent. Tomorrow, she'd show them exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. She finally dozed off in the small hours of the morning, the rifle within reach, dreaming of dusty streets and scattered papers, and a man on a horse who'd asked the one question that changed everything. "Who did this to you?" When Caleb's knock came just before dawn, she was already awake, dressed, and ready for war. The ride back to Willow Bend took 2 hours, and every minute of it felt like riding toward a cliff edge in the dark. Abigail kept her evidence packet wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her jacket, the papers pressed against her ribs like armor that wouldn't stop a bullet, but might stop a lie. Caleb rode beside her without talking much, which she appreciated. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't been said last night. They both knew what they were walking into. The town looked peaceful in the early morning light, almost pretty, if you didn't know what festered underneath the tidy storefronts and whitewashed fences. Smoke rose from breakfast fires. A dog barked somewhere. Normal Sunday sounds, people preparing for services and a day of rest. They tied their horses behind the livery where Tom Bradley gave them a long look, but didn't ask questions. Smart man. The church sat at the north end of Main Street, a simple wooden building with a bell tower that looked more ambitious than the rest of the structure could support. People were already gathering outside, the early arrivals in their Sunday clothes talking in clusters, while children ran between them. Abigail smoothed down her dress, the good one she'd been saving, dark blue with buttons that actually matched, and tried to look like a woman who had every right to be there instead of a fugitive about to start a riot. "You ready?" Caleb asked quietly. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." They crossed the street together, and Abigail felt the exact moment when people noticed her. The conversations didn't stop all at once. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they faltered and shifted, voices dropping to urgent whispers as heads turned. Elizabeth Doyle, Margaret's daughter-in-law, saw her first. The younger woman's face went pale, then flushed red. She grabbed her husband's arm and whispered something urgent. He turned, saw Abigail, and immediately started toward the church doors like he was going to warn someone inside. "Michael Doyle," Caleb's voice cut across the churchyard, calm but carrying. "Good morning." Michael stopped, clearly torn between his errand and the social requirement to acknowledge a greeting. Manners won, barely. "Boone, didn't expect to see you at services." "Special occasion," Caleb nodded toward Abigail. "Miss Harper has some business to conduct with the congregation." "Miss Harper shouldn't be here at all. There's a warrant." "Hasn't been issued yet," Abigail interrupted. "I checked with the county clerk's office yesterday. Takes 3 days to process, and you only filed on Friday, which means I'm still a free citizen with the right to attend public gatherings and speak in my own defense." It was a bluff. She hadn't checked anything. But Michael's expression told her she'd guessed right. The warrant was coming, but it wasn't official yet. "You're not welcome here," Elizabeth hissed, finding her voice. After what I did, Abigail kept her voice level, aware that more people were gathering, listening. "And what exactly did I do, Mrs. Doyle? Teach women to read? Help them check their own accounts? Those sound like services, not crimes. You stole from us. Made false accusations. Then I'm sure your mother-in-law will have no trouble proving that in a public forum, which is why I'm here. To face my accusers openly with evidence and witnesses the way justice is supposed to work." She moved toward the church doors before Elizabeth could respond. Caleb stayed close beside her, not touching, but present, a solid reminder that she wasn't alone. Inside, the church was already half full, families claiming their usual pews. The temperature dropped when Abigail entered, conversation freezing mid-word as heads swiveled. Margaret Doyle sat in the front row on the right side, the position of honor she'd occupied for 20 years. She looked up at Abigail's entrance, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or an anger. Then it smoothed into an expression of concerned disapproval. "Miss Harper." Margaret stood, her voice projecting beautifully. "How unfortunate. I'd hoped you would have had the grace to leave quietly rather than forcing us to involve the authorities." "Funny thing about that," Abigail said, walking down the center aisle. Her heart was hammering, but she kept her steps steady. "I've been thinking about grace, about who's expected to have it and who isn't. Seems like poor women are supposed to have the grace to accept their lot quietly, while wealthy women can do whatever they please and call it propriety." A ripple went through the congregation. Reverend Michaels appeared from the side door, looking flustered. "Miss Harper, this is highly irregular. If you have grievances, there are proper channels. The proper channels are owned by the people I'm grieving against." Abigail stopped at the front of the church, turning to face the congregation. Her hands were shaking, so she clasped them in front of her. "But I'm glad you mentioned propriety, Reverend, because I'm here to discuss exactly that. What's proper, what's right, and what's been happening in this town for years while everyone looked the other way." "This is outrageous, Margaret began. "It is outrageous," Abigail agreed. "Systematic theft is outrageous. Forged debt records are outrageous. Using people's inability to read as a weapon against them is outrageous, and I have proof." She pulled out the oilcloth packet, unwrapped it carefully. The documents looked official and damning in her hands. These are property transfer records from the courthouse. They show a pattern over the last 5 years. Widows and struggling families losing their land to settle store debts that were falsified. The amounts don't match the actual accounts. The timing is always when the husband dies or leaves town, and the properties all end up in the same hands. She held up the first document. The Martinez farm. 40 acres transferred to Margaret Doyle for $1,500 in debt. But Maria Martinez's actual account, which I reviewed with her, shows charges of maybe $300 over the relevant period. That woman couldn't read her own account, Margaret said coldly. She has no idea what she actually owed, which is exactly why you targeted her. Abigail's voice rose. Because she couldn't read. Because when you put a document in front of her saying she owed $1,500, she believed you. She signed away her land because she trusted that respectable people wouldn't lie to her. The church was dead silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Reverend Michaels cleared his throat. These are serious accusations, Miss Harper. Do you have actual evidence or just... I have copies of store accounts showing systematic overcharges. I have testimony from 11 women who've been taught to read their own books and discovered discrepancies. I have courthouse records showing property transfers that don't match the documented debts. She laid the papers on the altar, spreading them out. And I have a pattern that's been operating for years, targeting the most vulnerable people in this community. Lies. Margaret's voice was sharp as broken glass. This woman was fired for stealing from her employer. These so-called documents are forgeries she created to deflect blame. And the testimony she claims to have, from women she's manipulated and filled with false ideas, is that what we're calling literacy now? False ideas? The voice came from the back of the church. Every head turned. Martha Reed stood in the doorway, still in her traveling clothes, dusty from hard riding. And beside her was Eleanor Tate, clutching a leather satchel to her chest. Abigail's heart leapt. They were supposed to be in Silver Creek. Martha walked down the aisle with the kind of determination that came from being too angry to be afraid anymore. Miss Harper taught me to read my own account book, and when I did, I discovered 3 years of overcharges at the general store. Small amounts, carefully hidden. They added up to $40, more than my late husband earned in 2 months. Martha, you're confused, Margaret began. I'm not confused. I'm furious. Martha's voice shook. My Henry worked himself to death trying to pay debts we didn't actually owe. And all along you were stealing from us bit by bit, counting on us being too ignorant to notice. Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale but set. My husband works at the courthouse. He gave me access to property records so I could practice my reading. That's how I found the pattern Miss Harper is describing. These aren't forgeries. They're official documents that have been sitting in the courthouse for years, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking. Your husband will lose his position for this, Margaret said icily. Maybe, but he'll lose it for telling the truth, not for helping to cover up fraud. Eleanor opened her satchel, pulled out more papers. And we're not the only ones. After Miss Harper was driven out of town, other women started asking questions, started checking their own accounts. The lies only work when people can't read well enough to see them. More movement at the back of the church. Sarah Mendez entered, her worn dress carefully mended, her children clustered around her. Behind her came 3 more women, all students from Abigail's lessons, all looking terrified but standing firm. I was charged for items I never bought, Sarah said, her accent thick but her words clear. $3 a month for 6 months. When I question it, they tell me I forget, but I don't forget. I just couldn't read the account book to prove it. One by one, the other women stepped forward with their stories. Small overcharges, mysterious fees, debt amounts that didn't match what they remembered buying. Individually, each case seemed minor, easy to dismiss. But together, they painted a picture of systematic exploitation. The congregation was shifting now, uneasy whispers spreading. Some faces showed skepticism, but others, particularly women who struggled to read, who'd always felt vaguely cheated but couldn't prove it, were showing recognition. Margaret Doyle stood like a statue, her face carved from ice. When the women finally fell silent, she spoke with deadly calm. This is a coordinated attack on my family's reputation, orchestrated by a thief who's trying to avoid justice. These women have been manipulated, then let's examine the books. The voice belonged to Thomas Chen, a quiet merchant who rarely spoke at gatherings. He stood up from his pew, his face troubled. If Miss Harper's accusations are false, the actual ledgers will prove it. If the store's records match what these women were charged, there's no problem. But if they don't, our private business records are not subject to public review, Margaret's husband interjected. But our purchasing records are, Thomas continued. I've been buying supplies from your store for 6 years. If Miss Harper is right about the pattern, then maybe I've been overcharged too. And I have receipts. I keep every single one. More voices joined in, men who'd assumed their wives were just bad at managing money, now wondering if something else had been happening. Women who'd felt stupid for not understanding their accounts, realizing maybe they weren't the problem. Sheriff Crawford stood up, looking supremely uncomfortable. Now, folks, let's not get carried away. Mrs. Doyle is a respected member of this community. So is my husband, Martha said sharply. Respect doesn't mean immunity from scrutiny. There's a proper process for these complaints. The proper process requires filing a complaint with you, Sheriff. And you're married to Margaret Doyle's cousin. Abigail's voice cut through the rising noise. The judge who'd hear any case plays cards with Mr. Doyle every Friday. The territorial marshal who might have investigated is conveniently dead. So tell me, what exactly is the proper process when the people accused control all the channels of accountability? The silence that followed was thick with implications nobody wanted to voice. Reverend Michaels looked like a man watching his church service turn into a town hall crisis. Perhaps we should adjourn to... No. The word came from an unexpected source. Judge Harrison stood up from his usual pew, his weathered face troubled. No, I think we need to address this here and now, with witnesses, because Miss Harper is right about one thing. The appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as impropriety itself. He walked to the front, his presence commanding immediate attention. I've known the Doyle family for 20 years. I've played cards with Robert every Friday for most of that time, and that's exactly why I should not be the one to adjudicate any formal complaints against them. He turned to Margaret. If these accusations are false, then you should welcome an independent investigation that will clear your name definitively. Margaret's mask of composure finally cracked. You're taking the word of these women over mine after everything my family has done for this town. I'm saying that several citizens have raised concerns about business practices, and those concerns deserve proper examination. His voice was firm. And I'm also saying that if I were in your position, falsely accused, I would be demanding an investigation, not trying to prevent one. The logic was unassailable, and Margaret knew it. Abigail watched the older woman's face cycle through rage, calculation, and finally a cold determination that was somehow more frightening than the anger. Fine. Margaret's voice was clipped. Call for your investigation. Bring in territorial auditors, federal marshals, whoever you like. When they find nothing but the jealous fabrications of a failed woman and the confused testimony of ignorant housewives, I will expect public apologies from everyone involved in this travesty. That's all we're asking for, Bud, Abigail said quietly. Truth, transparency. Justice that doesn't depend on whether you can read your own account book. The church erupted into argument then, everyone talking at once. Some defended Margaret, insisting this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Others demanded immediate access to store records. A few tried to restore order, while most just added to the chaos. Caleb appeared at Abigail's elbow, speaking low. We should go. Before emotions run higher and someone decides to settle this with violence instead of words. He was right. Abigail gathered her papers, acutely aware that she'd accomplished her primary goal, making the accusations public, forcing the issue into the open where it couldn't be quietly buried. But she'd also made herself a target in a way she hadn't fully been before. As they moved toward the door, Margaret's voice cut through the noise. Miss Harper, Abigail turned. The older woman stood perfectly straight, her face a mask of controlled fury. You've made a grave mistake. Whatever you think you've accomplished here today, it will cost you more than you can imagine. Probably, Abigail agreed, but some things are worth the cost. Outside, the cool morning air felt like absolution. Abigail's hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving her weak-kneed and slightly nauseated. Martha and Eleanor caught up with them, both women looking equally wrung out. You were supposed to be in Silver Creek, Abigail managed. We got there. Martha's voice was grim. Heard about the marshal being dead. decided evidence sitting in a dead man's office wasn't going to do anyone any good, but evidence presented in front of 50 witnesses might. We rode back through the night, Eleanor added. Nearly killed the horses, but we made it. I could kiss you both. Save it. We're not done yet. Martha looked back at the church, where people were spilling out onto the street, still arguing. We started something here today, but starting it and finishing it are two different things. She was right. The next few hours proved it. By afternoon, the town had split into factions. The Doyle's supporters rallied at the general store, talking about defending decent people against malicious lies. Abigail's supporters, a smaller group but growing, gathered at the old Carver Street building, sharing their stories and comparing records. Sheriff Crawford appeared at the Carver Street building just before dusk, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Miss Harper, I need you to come with me. Abigail's stomach dropped. The warrant came through? No, but Mrs. Doyle has filed a complaint of slander and public disturbance. Judge Harrison wants to hear both sides before this gets any uglier. It's already ugly, Caleb said from where he'd been standing guard at the door. Question is whether it's going to be ugly and just, or ugly and corrupt. Crawford's face reddened. I'm trying to keep the peace here. By arresting the woman who exposed the corruption instead of the people who committed it? I'm not arresting anyone. I'm asking Miss Harper to come answer questions in a lawful proceeding. He turned to Abigail. You wanted this public. You wanted official attention. Well, you've got it. So come talk to the judge or admit you're just trying to cause trouble without facing the consequences. He had her there. Refusing to cooperate now would make her look guilty, like someone with something to hide. I'll come, but I'm bringing witnesses and I'm bringing my evidence. Wouldn't expect otherwise. The impromptu hearing took place in the judge's office, a cramped room that smelled like cigar smoke and old leather. Judge Harrison sat behind his desk, looking tired. Margaret Doyle sat to one side with her husband and two men Abigail didn't recognize. Lawyers, from the look of them, brought in from Silver Creek. Abigail sat across from them with Caleb standing behind her chair and Martha squeezed in beside her. It felt like a trial, which Abigail supposed it was. Judge Harrison opened a folder, scanned the contents, then looked at Abigail over his reading glasses. Miss Harper, you've made serious accusations against the Doyle family. Mrs. Doyle contends these accusations are false, defamatory, and designed to cover up your own criminal activities. This isn't a formal trial, but I need to determine whether there's enough substance to your claims to warrant bringing in territorial authorities, or whether we're dealing with a personal vendetta. I understand. Then let's start with the simplest question. You claim the Doyles have been systematically overcharging customers. What proof do you have? Abigail laid out her copies of account records, showing the pattern of small overcharges across multiple families. She walked through the math slowly, demonstrating how the discrepancies accumulated. One of the lawyers interrupted. These are copies, not originals. They could have been altered. Then compare them to the originals in the store, Abigail shot back. If I've altered anything, the actual ledgers will prove it. The store's private records are not subject to. If Mrs. Doyle wants to prove I'm lying, the easiest way is to produce the actual ledgers and show they match what I was charged. Abigail kept her voice level. Unless there's a reason she doesn't want them examined too closely. Margaret's face went tight. Our records are in perfect order, but I will not have my family's private business ransacked to satisfy this woman's delusions. Then how do you propose we settle this? Judge Harrison asked. By recognizing it for what it is, a vindictive attack by a woman who is caught stealing and is trying to deflect blame. Margaret's voice was ice. Miss Harper was terminated from her position at the lumber office for accounting irregularities. The fact that she then immediately began making wild accusations against other businesses should tell you everything you need to know about her credibility. I wasn't fired for irregularities, Abigail said. I was fired because Mr. Patterson received pressure from your family to let me go. He told me so himself. Do you have that in writing? No, but then it's your word against his. And Mr. Patterson has already submitted a statement saying he discovered discrepancies in the accounts you managed and had no choice but to terminate your employment. The trap was elegant. Patterson had been pressured from both sides now, first to fire her, then to justify it in writing. He'd chosen to protect his business, which Abigail couldn't really blame him for, but it left her looking exactly like what Margaret claimed, a dishonest bookkeeper trying to deflect blame. What about the property transfers? Martha spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. Those are official courthouse records, not something Miss Harper could have forged. Judge Harrison picked up Eleanor's documents, studied them carefully. These do show a pattern. Mrs. Doyle, can you explain why these families all transferred property to you for debts that seem disproportionate to their likely purchasing power? They accrued debt over time. When they couldn't pay, property was accepted as settlement. It's all perfectly legal. Legal if the debts were real, Abigail interrupted. But if the debts were inflated through systematic overcharges, then these transfers were obtained through fraud. That's a serious allegation, one of the lawyers said smoothly. And it rests entirely on the assumption that your accounting is accurate and Mrs. Doyle's is not. Given your recent termination for accounting irregularities, why should anyone believe your numbers over hers? It was a good question, and Abigail didn't have a good answer. Her evidence was solid, but her credibility had been systematically undermined. Then Caleb spoke up from behind her. I've got a question. Everyone turned to look at him. If Mrs. Doyle's records are accurate and Miss Harper's accusations are false, why not just open the books for independent review? Hire an auditor from outside the county, someone with no stake in the outcome. If everything's in order, it'll prove Miss Harper is lying and end this whole mess. If it's not, he let the implication hang. We are not obligated to prove our innocence, Margaret said coldly. No, but you're asking us to prove your guilt, which is a lot harder when you won't let anyone see the evidence. Caleb's voice was reasonable, which somehow made it more damning. Seems like innocent people would want the truth to come out. Only guilty people hide behind technicalities about private records. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, choosing his words carefully. Mrs. Doyle, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Boone. If you want me to dismiss these accusations as baseless, the simplest path is to allow independent verification of your records. I can appoint a neutral auditor, so— Absolutely not. Margaret stood up, her composure finally shattering. I will not subject my family to this humiliation based on the lies of a bitter, failed woman. If you want to pursue this farce, then do it through proper legal channels. File formal charges, present evidence in an actual court, follow the law. But I'm done entertaining this circus. She swept out of the office, her husband and lawyers scrambling to follow. Judge Harrison rubbed his face, looking every one of his 60 years. Well, that was unproductive. She's guilty, Martha said flatly. Innocent people don't refuse to prove their innocence when it would be simple to do so. Innocent people also have the right not to incriminate themselves, or in this case, to refuse unreasonable searches of private property. The judge sighed. Miss Harper, I believe you may be right about what's been happening, but belief isn't evidence, and I can't order an investigation based on suspicion alone. I need something concrete, something that doesn't require the Doyles' cooperation to verify. The women's testimony, Abigail began, is important, but contradicted by the official records from businesses the Doyles control. Unless we can prove those records were falsified, it's one person's word against another's. He looked genuinely sorry. I'm going to write to the territorial governor, explain the situation, and request that auditors be sent. But that will take weeks at minimum, possibly months. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you leave town for your own safety. Emotions are running high, and I can't guarantee what might happen. If I leave, the Doyles win. They'll use the time to destroy evidence, pressure witnesses. If you stay, you might end up dead in a ditch. Judge Harrison met her eyes. I'm trying to help you here, Miss Harper. Take it. Outside the judge's office, the sun was setting, painting Willow Bend in shades of orange and red that looked almost apocalyptic. Abigail felt the weight of failure settling on her shoulders. It's not over, Caleb said quietly. Isn't it? We need evidence we can't access, testimony that can be contradicted, and time we don't have. Abigail's voice cracked. I thought if we made it public, if we forced them to defend themselves, the truth would matter. But the truth doesn't matter when they control all the mechanisms for proving it. Then we find new mechanisms. How? Before Caleb could answer, Eleanor appeared, running down the street with her skirts bunched in her hands. Miss Harper, my husband just told me they're planning something. Who? The Doyles. They had a meeting at the store after we left the church. My husband's friend was there delivering supplies and overheard. They're going to burn the Carver Street building tonight. Destroy any evidence you might have stored there and blame it on you. Make it look like you're covering your tracks. Abigail's mind raced. There's nothing in that building except some old benches. Doesn't matter. It's about the story. You make accusations, then conveniently the building where you were conducting your lessons burns down before anyone can examine it properly. It makes you look guilty and eliminates a gathering place for the women supporting you. We need to warn people. Already did. Martha's spreading the word. But Miss Harper, that's not all. Eleanor's face was pale in the dying light. They're also planning to have the sheriff arrest you tomorrow morning. The warrant will be ready by then, and they're going to make a show of it. Public arrest, perp walk through town, the whole thing designed to humiliate you and discredit everything you said. Caleb swore softly. Judge was right. You need to leave town tonight. No. Abigail's voice was hard. That's what they want. They want me to run so they can say I fled because I was guilty. They want me to hide so they can control the narrative. She turned to Eleanor. What time are they planning to burn the building? Around midnight, when everyone's asleep. Then we'll be waiting for them. Abigail, Caleb started. They've taken everything else from me. My job, my reputation, my safety. But I'm not giving them the satisfaction of making me run. She looked at him directly. You don't have to stay for this part. You've already risked enough. Stop telling me to leave. His voice was quiet but firm. I'm seeing this through. But we're going to be smart about it. If we catch them trying to burn the building, we need witnesses. Credible ones who can't be dismissed or intimidated. They spent the next few hours preparing. Martha rallied the women who'd spoken up at the church, explaining the plan. Thomas Chen agreed to watch from his shop across the street. Even old Tom Bradley from the livery said he'd position himself where he could see. The more witnesses, the harder it would be for the Doyles to explain away what they were planning. As midnight approached, Abigail sat in the darkness of the Carver Street building with Caleb beside her, and Martha crouched near the window. The rifle was in her hands, loaded but with the safety on. They might not come, Martha whispered. They'll come. They need this building gone, and they need it to look like my fault. The minutes crawled by. Abigail's eyes adjusted to the darkness, picking out the shapes of the old benches where women had sat learning to read their own account books. Such a simple thing, literacy. But it had threatened a whole system built on keeping people ignorant. Then she heard it. Footsteps, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. The scrape of a boot on dirt. A whispered curse when someone stumbled. Through the window, she could see figures approaching. 3 men, one carrying what looked like a can of kerosene. Now? Martha breathed. Wait, Caleb murmured. Let them start. We need them caught in the act. The men reached the building. One of them pulled out matches, while another began splashing kerosene along the wall. The third stood watch, scanning the street. Abigail's heart hammered. If they lit the fire before anyone could stop them, the building would go up fast. But if they intervened too soon, the men could claim they were just, what? Taking a midnight stroll with kerosene? The match flared. Now! Caleb shouted, kicking open the door. The 3 men jumped, spinning around. The one with the matches dropped them, and for a heart-stopping moment, Abigail thought the kerosene would catch. But the matches hit dirt instead of the splashed wall, guttering out. Lights appeared in windows around the street. Tom Bradley emerged from the shadows with a shotgun. Thomas Chen opened his shop door, a lamp in his hand. What's going on here? Tom's voice carried across the street. The 3 men looked at each other, trapped. Abigail recognized one of them, Michael Doyle, Margaret's son. The other 2 were hired hands from their ranch. We were just, Michael began. Splashing kerosene on a building at midnight? Caleb's voice was hard. That's an interesting hobby. More people were emerging now, drawn by the commotion. Eleanor's husband appeared, still in his nightshirt. The baker from down the street. A dozen others, all witnesses to 3 men standing next to a building that reeked of accelerant, matches on the ground. Michael Doyle's face cycled through panic, anger, and finally calculation. This is a setup. She lured us here. With kerosene? Martha's voice dripped scorn. How exactly did she lure you into bringing accelerant and matches to burn down a building? We were told she was hiding stolen property here. We came to investigate. At midnight? Without the sheriff? With kerosene? Thomas Chen shook his head. Son, you're going to need a better story than that. Sheriff Crawford arrived, looking furious at being woken up. When he saw the scene, the kerosene, the matches, the witnesses, his face went carefully blank. Somebody want to explain this? Everyone started talking at once. Abigail let them, watching the sheriff's face as he realized there was no good way to spin this. Too many witnesses, too obvious what had been about to happen. Finally, Crawford held up his hands. All right, Michael Doyle, you and your men are coming with me. We'll sort this out in the morning when everyone's calmer. My mother will have your badge for this, Michael snarled. Your mother can file a complaint through proper channels. Crawford's voice was tired. But right now, I've got 3 men with kerosene and matches standing next to a building at midnight, and a dozen witnesses who saw it. So you're coming to the jail until I figure out what to do about this mess. As Crawford led the 3 men away, Abigail felt something shift. It wasn't victory. She was too exhausted for triumph. But it was proof. Undeniable, witnessed proof that the Doyles were willing to destroy evidence and frame her for it. Judge Harrison appeared in his nightshirt and coat, looking at the kerosene-splashed wall with disgust. This changes things. Does it? Abigail asked. Attempted arson in front of witnesses? Yes, Miss Harper, it changes things. He looked at the gathered crowd. I'll be writing that letter to the territorial governor first thing in the morning. And this time, I'll be requesting an immediate investigation, not a routine audit. Because it's become clear that we have a serious problem in Willow Bend, and it needs to be addressed before someone gets killed. And it needs to be. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in low voices. Some still defended the Doyles, claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But others, more than before, were looking troubled, questioning. Martha squeezed Abigail's arm. You did it. You made them show their hand. They'll regroup, come back harder. Probably. But you've got witnesses now. Documentation. You've made it impossible for them to sweep this away quietly. She smiled, tired but genuine. Sometimes that's all you can do. Shine enough light that the roaches can't hide. As the sun came up over Willow Bend, Abigail stood outside the Carver Street building, looking at the kerosene stains on the wall, evidence of how close they'd come to losing everything, but also evidence that she'd been right, that the fight was worth having, that sometimes refusing to break was the most powerful thing you could do. Caleb appeared beside her with coffee, because apparently that was just what he did now. Hell of a night, he said. Hell of a week. You should probably still leave town, at least until the territorial people arrive. Crawford can only hold those men for so long, and Margaret Doyle's not going to take this lying down. I know. Abigail sipped the terrible coffee, grateful for it anyway. But I'm not running. Not anymore. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then I guess we'd better get ready for whatever comes next. Whatever came next turned out to be a war of attrition that played out over the following days. The Doyles used every bit of influence they had, pressuring businesses to refuse service to anyone who'd supported Abigail, spreading rumors about her moral character, making life difficult for her allies in 100 small ways. But something had fundamentally changed. The attempted arson had been too blatant, too witnessed, and more importantly, the women who'd learned to read their own account books were done being silent. They organized. Quietly at first, then more openly. They compared records, documented overcharges, supported each other when the Doyles tried to intimidate them. They became a force that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. And when the territorial auditors finally arrived 2 weeks later, they had a mountain of evidence waiting for them. The investigation would take months, the legal proceedings even longer. But the empire Margaret Doyle had built on ignorance and exploitation was finally beginning to crumble. And Abigail Harper, the woman they'd tried to break, stood at the center of it all, spine straight and eyes clear, refusing to be anything less than what she'd always been. Dangerous, honest, unbreakable. The territorial auditors arrived on a Thursday, 3 men in suits that looked out of place in Willow Bend's dusty streets. They set up in the judge's chambers and spent their first day just reading through the initial complaints and evidence. Abigail watched them from across the street, fighting the urge to march over there and demand progress. They'll work at their own pace, Caleb said. He'd taken to appearing at her elbow at random times throughout the day, like he'd appointed himself her unofficial guardian. Pushing won't help. Waiting might get someone killed. Abigail hadn't forgotten the marshal in Silver Creek, shot in the back outside his office. Which is why you're staying at the ranch until this settles. She'd been staying in the foreman's cabin for 3 weeks now, riding into town only when necessary. It chafed, feeling like hiding, but Caleb was right that it was safer. The Doyles had gone quiet since the attempted arson, which somehow felt more threatening than their previous aggression. That evening, as Abigail was preparing to ride back to the ranch, Eleanor found her at the livery. "Miss Harper, there's someone who wants to talk to you. Says it's important, but it has to be private." Abigail's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol Caleb had insisted she start carrying. "Who?" "Anna Kowalski, the widow whose property was transferred to Mrs. Doyle 3 years ago." Abigail remembered the name from the courthouse records. 42 acres of good farmland signed over to settle a debt of $600 that should have been less than a third of that. "Where is she?" "The old schoolhouse. She's scared, Miss Harper. Took her this long to work up the courage." The schoolhouse was abandoned, too run down for current use, but not quite collapsed enough to tear down. Anna Kowalski sat on a dusty bench, her hands twisted in her apron. She was maybe 50, worn thin by hard work and grief. "Mrs. Kowalski," Abigail said gently, "Eleanor said you wanted to talk." The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "I should have come forward before, at the church when you asked for testimony, but I was afraid. You're here now. That's what matters. My husband died 4 years ago, fell from the barn roof, broke his neck." Anna's voice was barely above a whisper. "I couldn't read, couldn't cipher beyond simple sums. Mrs. Doyle came to the funeral, so kind, so helpful. She said my husband had debts at the store, that I needed to settle them before I could properly grieve." Abigail sat down beside her, waiting. "She brought papers, said I owed $600, that the farm could settle it. I didn't know what to do. My son was only 12, couldn't help me understand. The other women in town, they all deferred to Mrs. Doyle on matters of business, so I signed." Anna wiped her eyes roughly. "I signed away the land my husband died working, and I didn't even understand what I was doing." "Did you keep any records? Receipts from purchases?" "Some, not many. My husband handled most of it." Anna pulled a small bundle from her apron pocket. "But I found these in his things last month. Letters between him and Mrs. Doyle from before he died." Abigail unfolded the first letter carefully. It was dated 6 months before Mr. Kowalski's death, written in a flowing hand that had to be Margaret's. The content made her blood run cold. It wasn't about store debts at all. It was about a property dispute between the Kowalskis and a rancher named Davidson who'd wanted to buy their water rights. Margaret had offered to mediate the dispute, offering legal advice and suggesting settlement terms. The letter referenced meetings, discussions about property values, mentions of contracts being drawn up. "Did your husband settle with Davidson?" Abigail asked. "No. He refused to sell. Said our water was worth more than Davidson was offering, that we shouldn't let ourselves be pressured." Anna's voice broke. "A week later, he fell. Or that's what everyone said. But Miss Harper, my husband had been climbing on that barn roof for 20 years. He was careful, always careful. And the day he fell, he'd told me he was going to town to talk to a lawyer about something that was worrying him. He wouldn't tell me what." The implications settled over Abigail like a shroud. "You think he didn't fall?" "I don't know. I'll never know. But I know that after he died, Mrs. Doyle suddenly had papers saying we owed $600, and I was too grieving and stupid to question it. And I know that 6 months after I signed over the farm, Mrs. Doyle sold the water rights to Davidson for $3,000. Abigail's hands tightened on the letters. This was bigger than overcharging at a store. This was conspiracy, fraud on a massive scale, possibly even murder. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need to give these letters to the auditors. Are you willing to testify about what happened? Will it bring my husband back? Will it give me back the 4 years I've spent living in a boarding house, taking in washing because I don't have land anymore?" "No, but it might stop her from doing it to someone else." Anna was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, sharp. "Then take them. Do what you have to do." The next morning, Abigail brought the letters to the territorial auditors. The lead investigator, a thin man named Morrison with wire-rimmed glasses, read them 3 times before he spoke. "This changes the scope of our investigation significantly." "I thought it might. We'll need to interview Mrs. Kowalski, and we'll need to look into this Davidson transaction, see if there are other similar cases." He looked at Abigail over his glasses. Miss Harper, you understand that what you're suggesting is extremely serious. If Mrs. Doyle was using her position to orchestrate property transfers for profit, possibly even arranging accidents to expedite those transfers. I understand, and I think if you dig deep enough, you'll find it's not just Willow Bend. The marshal in Silver Creek was investigating land fraud before he was killed. The patterns might connect. Morrison's expression went grim. We'll look into it. In the meantime, I'm going to strongly suggest you not stay anywhere predictable. If you're right about the extent of this, you're a significant threat to some very dangerous people. Abigail left the judge's chambers feeling both vindicated and terrified. She'd wanted the truth to come out, but the truth was turning out to be darker than she'd imagined. Caleb was waiting outside with the horses. One look at her face and he asked, "How bad?" "Worse than we thought. Possibly a lot worse." She filled him in as they rode back to the ranch, watching his expression harden with each new detail. "Morrison's right," he said when she finished. "You can't stay in Willow Bend. Can't even stay at my ranch. That's the first place they'd look. I'm not running. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to be smart." He pulled his horse to a stop, turned to face her fully. "Abigail, if they killed that marshal, if they possibly killed Kowalski, what makes you think they'd hesitate to kill you?" "Because I've made it too public. Too many people know what I found." "What?" "Which just means they have to be more careful about how they do it. An accident, a robbery gone wrong, a fall from a horse on a lonely road." His voice was urgent, almost angry. "You've won. The investigation is happening. The truth is coming out, but you have to survive long enough to see it through." "Where would I even go?" "My sister lives in Denver. She'd take you in, no questions asked. You could stay there until the auditors finish their work, until it's safe to come back." The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was smart, practical, the sensible thing to do. But something in Abigail rebelled at the idea of leaving now, when everything was finally moving forward. "I need to think about it." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded. "Don't think too long. Every day you stay is another day they have to plan something." That evening, as Abigail sat in the cabin trying to decide what to do, she heard rapid hoofbeats approaching. She grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the window. It was Martha, riding hard and clearly terrified. Abigail threw open the door. "What happened?" "They burned my barn." Martha was shaking, her face streaked with soot. "Everything. My hay stores, my equipment, the winter feed I'd saved, it's all gone." "When?" "Hour ago. I was in the house when I smelled smoke. By the time I got outside, it was fully ablaze. Nothing I could do but watch it burn." Martha's voice cracked. "The sheriff came, said it was probably a spark from my stove that caught the wind. But Miss Harper, I haven't used that stove in weeks. It's been too hot." Abigail helped Martha inside, got her sitting down with water. Caleb appeared from the main house, took one look at the situation, and went to tend Martha's exhausted horse. "It's a warning," Martha said when she'd caught her breath. "They're telling me what happens to people who testify against them. My barn today, maybe my house tomorrow, maybe me. We'll get you protection. The auditors can arrange." "Protection from who?" "The sheriff's in their pocket, half the town's too scared to speak up, and the territorial authorities are 3 days right away." Martha laughed bitterly. "I thought I was being brave standing up with you. Turns out I was just being stupid." "You're not stupid. You're fighting against people who've had power for so long they think they're entitled to it. And they're willing to burn down anyone who disagrees." Martha met Abigail's eyes. "I'm telling you this not to scare you, though heaven knows you should be scared. I'm telling you because you need to know what you're up against. These people won't stop. They'll escalate until someone's dead, and I don't want it to be you." After Martha left, refusing to stay at the ranch, insisting she needed to salvage what she could from the fire, Abigail sat alone in the cabin, the rifle across her lap, thinking about choices and consequences. She'd started this wanting justice, wanting to expose corruption and help vulnerable women. Somewhere along the way, it had become a war, and wars had casualties. Martha's barn was just the latest. Who would be next? A knock on the cabin door made her jump. She raised the rifle before recognizing Caleb's voice. "It's me. Can I come in?" She unlocked the door. He entered carrying a wrapped bundle that turned out to be dinner, bread, cheese, some kind of stew that was probably from his own kitchen. "You need to eat." I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Can't fight on an empty stomach. He set the food on the table, then sat down across from her. I heard about Martha's barn, saw the smoke from here. They're escalating. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. The offer still stands. My sister in Denver. I could have you on a stage tomorrow, out of their reach. And Martha? And Eleanor? And Anna Kowalski? And all the other women who stuck their necks out because I convinced them it was safe? Abigail's voice was sharp with frustration. I can't just abandon them. You're not abandoning them by staying alive. The investigation doesn't need you here anymore. Morrison has all your evidence, all the testimony. Your job is done. My job isn't done until Margaret Doyle and everyone who helped her face consequences. Consequences won't mean anything if you're dead. The words hung between them, too loud in the small cabin. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, visibly trying to calm himself. I'm sorry, he said finally. I shouldn't yell, but watching you put yourself in danger day after day, knowing that at any moment someone might decide you're too much of a threat to leave alive, it's harder than I expected. Why? The question came out before Abigail could stop it. Why do you care so much? You barely knew me a month ago. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable and honest in his expression. Because when I saw you in that street, surrounded by people who wanted to break you, and you refused to give them the satisfaction, I saw someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth... He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. I've spent most of my adult life building walls, keeping people at a distance. Easier that way, safer. But you walked into my life scared and furious and determined to do the right thing, even if it destroyed you, and somehow you knocked down every wall I'd built. Abigail's throat tightened. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything, he continued. I know you've got bigger concerns than whatever this is between us. But I need you to understand that it's not just about justice anymore for me. It's about you, and I can't stand the thought of something happening to you when I could have prevented it. By sending me away, by keeping you alive long enough to see this through. He leaned forward, his voice urgent. Go to Denver. Stay with my sister. When the investigation is done, when it's safe, come back. I'll be here. This ranch will be here. And if you want... He stopped again, vulnerability flickering across his face. If you want, we can figure out what comes next. Together. It was the closest he'd come to saying what had been building between them for weeks. The late-night conversations. The way he appeared whenever she needed help without being asked. The coffee that was terrible but showed up every morning anyway. The quiet, steady presence that had somehow become the most important thing in her chaotic world. I can't, Abigail said, and watched something flicker in his eyes, hurt, maybe, or resignation. Not because I don't want to, but because if I leave now, I'm admitting they win. That power and violence can shut down truth and justice if you just apply enough of it. Sometimes the powerful do win. That's reality. Then someone needs to change that reality. She reached across the table, took his hand. You asked me once why I wouldn't just let it go, why I had to fight. It's because I watched my father lose his business to men who lied better than he did. I watched my mother fade away because she couldn't read the contract she signed when he died. I've spent my whole life watching good people get crushed by corruption and telling myself it wasn't my problem. But it is my problem. Because if I won't fight it, who will? Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. Then I'm staying with you, whatever happens. You could lose everything. I've already decided that losing you would be worse. He said it simply, like it was just a fact he'd accepted. So we'll see this through together, but we do it smart. No more staying places people expect, no more predictable patterns. And if they come for you, they'll have to go through me first. The next 2 weeks were a strange combination of tedium and terror. The auditors worked methodically through years of records, interviewing witnesses and following paper trails. Margaret Doyle hired lawyers from as far as San Francisco, building a defense that claimed every accusation was either misunderstanding or malicious fabrication. Abigail stayed at this ranch most days, venturing into town only when Morrison needed clarification on some detail. Caleb didn't let her go anywhere alone. Even trips to the creek for water involved one of them keeping watch. The isolation was wearing, but it gave Abigail time to think about things she'd been too busy surviving to consider, like what she'd do when this was over, like whether Willow Bend would even be livable afterward, or whether the town would be too poisoned by conflict, like what Caleb had meant when he talked about figuring out what came next together. She was hanging laundry behind the cabin one afternoon. Caleb had insisted she keep up normal routines to avoid going crazy from confinement, when she heard a horse approaching at a gallop. Her hand moved to the pistol in her apron pocket before she recognized Eleanor, riding like demons were chasing her. "They arrested Martha," Eleanor gasped out before she'd even dismounted properly. "Sheriff Crawford came this morning with a warrant. They're saying she started the fire at her own barn to frame the Doyles." "That's insane." "They have a witness. One of the Doyle ranch hands says he saw Martha buying kerosene in Silver Creek 2 days before the fire. Says she told him she needed it for her stove." "Martha's stove doesn't use kerosene, it burns wood." "I know. Everyone who's ever been to her house knows. But the witness is swearing to it, and Crawford arrested her for arson and insurance fraud." Eleanor's voice shook. "She's in jail, Miss Harper, and the judge set bail at $500. She doesn't have that kind of money." Abigail's mind raced. This was retaliation for Martha testifying, obviously, but it was also strategic. With Martha in jail, other witnesses would think twice about speaking to the auditors. Fear would spread, testimony would dry up, and the investigation might stall. "I'll pay the bail." Both Eleanor and Caleb, who'd appeared from the barn, stared at her. "You don't have $500, Caleb said. "No, but you do." Abigail turned to him. "I know you keep cash for horse purchases. Lend it to me. I'll pay you back." "It's not about the money." His voice was careful. "If you post Martha's bail, you're painting a target on yourself. The Doyles will use it as proof that you're orchestrating a conspiracy against them. And if Martha runs, she won't run. You don't know that. $500 is a powerful incentive to disappear." "I know Martha Reed. She's not going anywhere." Abigail met his eyes. "And if I don't help her, I'm saying that solidarity only matters when it's convenient, that I'll convince women to speak up but abandon them when they face consequences." Caleb studied her face, then sighed. "You're going to do this no matter what I say, aren't you?" "Yes." "Then at least let me come with you. And we bring witnesses, make it clear the bail money is a loan with terms, something that can't be twisted into you bribing her silence." They rode into town as the afternoon sun started its descent. Abigail carried $500 in a sealed envelope, along with a hastily written loan agreement that Eleanor's husband had witnessed. The money felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The sheriff's office was small and hot, smelling of sweat and old coffee. Crawford looked up from his desk when they entered, his expression souring when he saw Abigail. "Miss Harper, come to confess to conspiracy?" "I'm here to post bail for Martha Reed." His eyebrows rose. "That's a lot of money for a ledger keeper to have lying around." "It's a loan, properly documented." She laid the envelope and agreement on his desk. $500, as set by Judge Harrison. Crawford counted the money slowly, like he was hoping to find it short. When he couldn't, he looked almost disappointed. "This doesn't change anything. Mrs. Reed still has to stand trial for arson." "I'm aware. That's what bail is for, ensuring she appears for trial, not punishing her before she's been convicted." "You're awfully confident she'll show up." "I am." Abigail kept her voice level. "Because unlike some people, Martha Reed actually respects the law." The barb hit home. Crawford's face reddened, but he couldn't refuse a legally posted bail. He went back to the cells, returning a few minutes later with Martha, who looked exhausted and scared but defiant. "Someone posted my bail?" Martha's voice was hoarse. "Abigail did," Eleanor said, moving to hug her friend. "We're getting you out of here." Outside the jail, Martha grabbed Abigail's arm. "You shouldn't have done this. That's your entire savings. It's a loan, not a gift. You'll pay me back when this is over and you've recovered from losing your barn." Abigail tried to sound confident. "Besides, we couldn't let you sit in jail on false charges." "They're saying I set the fire myself, that I was trying to frame the Doyles and collect insurance money." Martha's laugh was bitter. "I didn't even have insurance, couldn't afford it." "Then that'll be easy enough to prove in court." "Will it? Or will they find some other lie, some other witness who swears to seeing what they need them to see?" Martha's expression was haunted. "I'm realizing that truth doesn't matter much when you're fighting people who control what truth gets heard." It was an echo of Abigail's own fears, and she didn't have a good response. That evening, back at the ranch, Caleb found Abigail sitting on the cabin steps, watching the sun set. "You gave away all your money today," he said, settling beside her. "I gave away your money, which I'll pay back." "I'm not worried about the money." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm worried about you. About what happens when this is over and you've burned every bridge in Willowbend." "I haven't burned bridges. I've just exposed the fact that some of those bridges were rotten to begin with." "Same result, though. You won't be able to stay here afterward." The truth of it settled over Abigail like a weight. She'd known it intellectually, but hearing Caleb say it made it real. When this was done, if she survived it, she'd have to leave Willowbend. The town would be too divided, too raw. Half the people would see her as a hero, the other half as a troublemaker who destroyed their community's peace. "Where will you go?" Caleb asked. "I don't know. Maybe Denver. Maybe further." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Will you stay here? Ranch is here. Horses are here. Can't exactly pack up and move on a whim." He paused. "But I've been thinking about expansion, maybe a satellite operation somewhere else, someplace that needs good breeding stock." "Somewhere like Denver?" "For example." His voice was careful, not quite asking, but leaving the door open. Abigail wanted to reach for his hand, to acknowledge what he was offering. A future, a partnership, something beyond just surviving the present crisis. But she couldn't let herself think that far ahead, not when every day still felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. "Ask me again when we're not both waiting to see if I get killed," she said softly. "That's a deal." He stood, offered her his hand to help her up. "Come on. I made dinner and it's only slightly burned this time." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Morrison, the lead auditor, requested Abigail's presence at the judge's chambers. When she arrived with Caleb, she found Judge Harrison, Morrison, and two men she didn't recognize, federal marshals from the look of them. "Miss Harper," Morrison said, "we've completed our preliminary investigation. What we've found is extensive enough that we're bringing in federal authorities." One of the marshals stepped forward. "I'm Marshal Amos Reeve. I understand you were trying to contact my predecessor before he was killed." Abigail's heart stuttered. "You're the new territorial marshal, acting marshal until the position is officially filled. But yes." His expression was grim. "Morrison briefed me on what you found here. It matches patterns we've been tracking across 3 territories, systematically targeting widows and illiterate property owners, using falsified debts to acquire land at fraction of its value, then selling mineral or water rights at massive profit." "It's bigger than Willowbend," Abigail said. "Much bigger. We believe there's an organized network operating across the frontier, using local collaborators like Mrs. Doyle to execute the scheme while keeping themselves at a distance." Reeve pulled out a map, marked with red circles. "We've identified similar operations in 7 counties. Combined, they've illegally acquired property worth over $200,000. The number was staggering. Abigail had known Margaret was corrupt, but this suggested she was just one piece of something much larger. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we arrest everyone involved and dismantle the network." Reeve's voice was hard. "But I need to know. Are you willing to testify? This will go to territorial court, possibly federal. You'll be the primary witness connecting the documents to the actual scheme. It won't be easy, and the defense will come after your credibility hard." "I'll testify." "Even knowing it could take months? That you might have to travel to multiple jurisdictions as we prosecute different members of the network?" Abigail thought about Anna Kowalski, her husband dead and her farm stolen, about Martha Reed sitting in jail on false charges, about every woman who'd been cheated and silenced and told her confusion was her own fault. "I'll testify," she said again, firmer this time. Reeve nodded, satisfied. "Then we move tomorrow. I have warrants for Margaret Doyle, her husband Robert, their son Michael, and 6 others involved in the Willowbend operation. We'll execute them simultaneously at dawn to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence." That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or catastrophe, and she couldn't stop imagining all the ways it could go wrong. She was still awake when she heard movement outside the cabin. Her hand went to the rifle before Caleb's low voice came through the door. "It's me." Couldn't sleep either. She let him in. He'd brought a bottle of whiskey and 2 cups. "Thought you might need this," he said, pouring. The whiskey burned going down, but it settled her nerves slightly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to night sounds through the open window. "Tomorrow everything changes," Caleb said finally. I know. If this works, if they actually arrest Margaret Doyle and the charges stick, you'll be the woman who brought down a criminal empire. That's going to make you either very famous or very hated, depending on who you ask. Probably both. Probably. He refilled her cup. And then what? After the trials and testimony and everything settles? Then I figure out who I am when I'm not fighting for my life. Abigail met his eyes. And maybe, if you're still interested in that expansion operation in Denver, we could talk about what that might look like. Something in Caleb's expression softened. That's not much of a commitment. It's all I've got right now. Everything else feels like counting chickens that haven't hatched. Fair enough? He raised his cup. To chickens, then, and to surviving long enough to count them. They touched cups, drank, and sat together in the darkness, waiting for dawn and everything it would bring. When the sun rose the next morning, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that looked almost prophetic, Abigail dressed carefully, braided her hair tight, and checked her pistol one last time. Caleb was waiting outside with the horses. Ready? He asked. No, but let's go anyway. They rode toward Willow Bend together, toward the confrontation that would either end Margaret Doyle's empire or cement her power forever. Toward a future that was uncertain, but finally, after weeks of fear and fighting, felt possible. And for the first time since her carpetbag had hit the dirt in Willow Bend's main street, Abigail Harper allowed herself to hope. The arrests happened fast and without ceremony. Marshal Reeve and his men moved through Willow Bend like a thunderstorm, executing warrants before most of the town had finished their breakfast. By the time Abigail and Caleb reached Main Street, Margaret Doyle was already in custody, standing on the sidewalk outside her house with her wrists bound while a deputy searched the premises. Abigail had imagined this moment 100 times. Margaret's defeat, her empire crumbling, justice finally being served. But seeing it happen in real life felt stranger than she'd expected. Margaret didn't look broken or humiliated. She looked coldly furious, her spine straight and her chin up, every inch the respectable matron being wrongly persecuted. This is a travesty, Margaret announced to the growing crowd. An innocent woman arrested on the word of thieves and liars. Mark my words, when the truth comes out, every person involved in this persecution will regret it. Marshal Reeve was unmoved. Save it for the judge, Mrs. Doyle. You'll have plenty of opportunity to present your defense. My lawyers will have you removed from your position for this outrage. Your lawyers can file whatever complaints they want. Doesn't change the evidence. He nodded to his deputies. Take her to the territorial jail. We'll transport her to Silver Creek this afternoon. As Margaret was led away, still protesting, Abigail caught the older woman's eyes. For just a moment, pure hatred blazed there, so intense it made Abigail step back. You did this, Margaret said, her voice low and venomous. You'll pay for it. If it takes the rest of my life, I'll make sure you pay. Then she was gone, loaded into a wagon with bars on the windows, and Abigail was left standing in the street feeling oddly hollow. You all right? Caleb asked quietly. I thought I'd feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Abigail watched the wagon roll away. Mostly, I just feel tired. That's because it's not over yet. This is just the beginning of the legal battle. He was right. The arrests were dramatic, but the real work would happen in courtrooms over the coming months. And Margaret Doyle, even in custody, still had resources and connections that Abigail didn't. The next week brought a flurry of activity. Lawyers descended on Willow Bend like locusts. Margaret's defense team, 3 men from San Francisco with expensive suits and sharper tongues, immediately filed motions to dismiss, claiming the evidence was obtained improperly and the charges were politically motivated. Morrison and the federal prosecutors countered with depositions, financial records, and witness testimony that painted a damning picture of systematic fraud spanning years and multiple territories. Abigail spent 3 days being questioned by Margaret's lawyers, who tried every trick they could think of to discredit her. They brought up her termination from the lumber office, her lack of formal education, her questionable moral character as an unmarried woman living on a man's ranch without a chaperone. Miss Harper, the lead defense attorney said with false sympathy, isn't it true that you harbor resentment toward successful women because of your own failures? No. Isn't it true that you've never been able to hold a position for more than 2 years? I've moved towns. That's not the same as being unable to hold a position. and yet you were fired from your most recent employment for accounting irregularities. I was fired because I uncovered fraud, and the people committing it had more power than I did." Abigail kept her voice steady. "If you want to make that sound like a personal failing, go ahead. But the numbers don't lie, even when people do." The depositions were grueling, but Abigail held firm. She'd spent too many weeks preparing, too many nights going over her evidence to be shaken by lawyers trying to make her doubt herself. What wore on her more was the town's reaction. Willow Bend split down the middle. Half the people saw the arrests as justice finally being served. The other half saw it as outside interference destroying a respectable family on the word of malcontents and troublemakers. The division played out in small, vicious ways. Eleanor's husband was let go from his courthouse position, told his services were no longer needed. Sarah Mendez found a dead cat on her doorstep with a note warning her to reconsider her testimony. Thomas Chen's shop windows were broken 3 times in 1 week. "They're trying to intimidate everyone into silence," Martha said at a gathering of Abigail's supporters in the Carver Street building. The arson charges against her had been quietly dropped once the prosecution admitted their witness had been paid to lie, but the fear lingered. If we back down now, everything we've done means nothing. But what if backing down is smarter? This from June Bell, whose children had been harassed at school. What if we're just making everything worse? Worse for who? Abigail asked. For us? Yes, probably. But better for the next woman who can't read her account book. Better for the next widow who signs away her property because she trusts that respectable people wouldn't lie to her. That's easy to say when you don't have children whose safety you're worried about. You're right. It is easy for me to say that. I don't have children. I don't have property I could lose. All I have is the knowledge that if I stay silent now, I'm saying their power matters more than our truth. Abigail looked around at the gathered women. But I'm not asking you to sacrifice your families for this. If you need to step back, I understand. Just tell me now so I know who I can count on when we go to trial. Silence fell. Then Eleanor stood up. I'm in. My husband already lost his job. Might as well make it count for something. Anna Kowalski rose next. They stole my husband's farm. Made me think I was stupid for not understanding what I signed. I'm done being quiet about it. One by one, the other women stood. Not all of them. A few left quietly, choosing safety over solidarity, and Abigail couldn't blame them, but enough remained that she knew they had a chance. The preliminary hearing was set for early October in Silver Creek, the nearest town with facilities to handle a case of this magnitude. Abigail made the journey with Marshal Reeve and a convoy of witnesses, all of them under guard because the threats had escalated from broken windows to actual violence. Someone had shot at Eleanor's house one night, the bullet lodging in the doorframe 6 inches from where her youngest daughter had been sleeping. Thomas Chen had been jumped by 3 men on his way home from the shop, beaten badly enough that he'd spent 2 days recovering before he could travel. This is what happens when you challenge power, Reeve said grimly as they rode. The powerful don't give it up without a fight. They'll use every tool they have, legal, financial, violent, to maintain their position. Then why do you do it? Abigail asked. Why risk your life to enforce laws against people who can hire expensive lawyers and buy off witnesses? Because if I don't, who will? Someone has to stand between the powerful and the powerless, or the powerful just keep taking everything. He looked at her directly. Same reason you're doing this. You saw something wrong and decided you couldn't live with yourself if you walked away. The hearing lasted 3 days. Margaret's lawyers presented her as a respected businesswoman being persecuted by a jealous conspiracy. They brought character witnesses who testified to her generosity, her church work, her contributions to the community. Then the prosecution presented the financial records. Page after page of falsified debts, inflated charges, property transfers that benefited Margaret while impoverishing the families involved. They showed the pattern across multiple counties, demonstrated the connections between Margaret and the larger criminal network, laid bare years of systematic exploitation. The judge, a territorial appointee from Santa Fe who had no connections to Willow Bend, listened carefully to both sides. When the defense rested, he took less than an hour to deliberate. I find sufficient evidence to bind Mrs. Margaret Doyle and her co-defendants over for trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and theft by deception. Bail is denied given the severity of the charges and the defendant's financial resources. Trial is set for January 12th. Margaret's face went white, then red. This is a miscarriage of justice. This is due process, Mrs. Doyle. You'll have every opportunity to present your defense at trial. The judge's voice was firm. But the evidence suggests a deliberate long-term scheme to defraud vulnerable citizens, and I will not allow you to remain free while that case is adjudicated. As Margaret was led back to the jail, Abigail felt something release in her chest. Not quite relief. The trial itself would be harder than the hearing, but a sense that finally, after months of fighting, the system was actually working. Outside the courthouse, Morrison caught up with her. You did well in there. Didn't let them shake you. Felt like they shook me plenty. Maybe on the inside, but the judge saw a credible witness who knew her facts and stood by them. That matters. He paused. I should tell you, the defense is going to come after you hard at trial. They'll dig up everything they can about your past. Try to make you look vindictive or unstable. Are you prepared for that? No, but I'll do it anyway. Morrison smiled slightly. That seems to be your approach to everything. The months between the hearing and the trial were strange. Abigail couldn't return to Willow Bend. Too many threats. Too much hostility. She stayed in Silver Creek instead, taking a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who'd heard about the case and offered her a place at half the usual rate. Caleb visited every week, making the day-long ride from his ranch to bring her supplies and news from Willow Bend. The town, he reported, was slowly coming to terms with what had happened. Some folks are starting to ask questions, he said during one visit, checking their own accounts, comparing notes. Turns out once you teach people to read their numbers, they start finding all kinds of interesting discrepancies. Are they angry? Some at the Doyles, some at you for disrupting their comfortable ignorance, but yeah, mostly angry. He handed her a letter. This came for you, from the Territorial Board of Education. Abigail opened it with shaking hands. She'd almost forgotten about the letter Judge Harrison had mentioned sending months ago, recommending her for a position leading literacy programs. The offer was formal and generous. They wanted her to establish reading programs across 4 counties, focusing on practical skills, account books, contracts, legal documents. The work that had gotten her driven out of Willow Bend, now being offered as a paid position with backing from the territorial government. That's good news, Caleb said, reading her expression. Right? It's validation. Proof that what I was doing mattered. Abigail refolded the letter carefully. But I can't accept. Not until after the trial. If I take a government position now, Margaret's lawyers will use it to claim the prosecution is politically motivated. When this is over, though. When this is over, Abigail trailed off, thinking about the future for the first time in months. When this is over, I want to build something. Not just expose corruption, but create systems that make it harder for corruption to thrive in the first place. Sounds like the kind of thing that needs a central location. Office space, maybe. Somewhere between the counties you'd be serving. Caleb's voice was carefully casual. I've been looking at property in Denver, thinking about that expansion operation we discussed. Are you asking me something? I'm saying that when you're ready to build that something you want to build, I'd like to be part of it, in whatever capacity you'll have me. He met her eyes. Business partner, if that's all you want. Something more, if you're interested. But either way, I'm not walking away now. Not after everything. Abigail felt her throat tighten. For so long, she'd been fighting alone, convinced that accepting help meant weakness or dependence. But Caleb had proven that partnership could mean strength. That standing beside someone didn't make you smaller. It made you both larger. Ask me again after the trial, she said softly. When I'm not terrified, I'm going to end up dead or discredited. That's what you said last time, and I mean it more now. She reached across the table, took his hand. I want to say yes, Caleb. I want to plan a future that includes you, but I can't let myself think that far ahead until I know I'll live long enough to see it. He squeezed her fingers. Then I'll keep asking until you're ready to answer. The trial began on a cold January morning with snow threatening on the horizon. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from as far as San Francisco, curious citizens, supporters, and opponents of the defendants. Abigail sat in the witness section, acutely aware that she'd be spending most of the next few weeks on the stand being cross-examined. The prosecution opened with a clear, devastating presentation of the evidence. They showed the pattern of fraud, the falsified documents, the testimony of victims. They demonstrated how Margaret had used her social position to exploit vulnerable people, how she'd built wealth on the backs of widows and illiterate families. Then it was the defense's turn, and they came out swinging. They painted Margaret as a scapegoat, an innocent businesswoman caught up in a larger conspiracy she knew nothing about. They suggested the real criminals were the people running the territorial fraud network, and that Margaret had been manipulated or coerced into participating. And then they turned their attention to Abigail. The prosecution's entire case rests on the testimony of Miss Abigail Harper, the lead defense attorney announced. A woman with no formal credentials, no stable employment history, and a documented pattern of making accusations against her employers. Let's examine her credibility, shall we? Over the next 2 days, they attacked everything about Abigail. Her education, dismissed as insufficient for the accounting work she claimed to do. Her employment history, presented as a series of failures and conflicts. Her character, questioned because she was unmarried, living on a man's ranch, inserting herself into other women's business. Isn't it true, Miss Harper, that you were terminated from every position you've held in the last 5 years? I left 2 of those positions voluntarily to relocate. I was terminated from the 3rd after I uncovered fraud. Fraud you claim to have uncovered, but you have no evidence beyond your own assertions. I have copies of the records. Copies you made yourself, which could have been altered to support your accusations. Then compare them to the originals. The originals, which conveniently can't be examined because you've convinced the court to seize them as evidence. The attorney's smile was sharp. Very convenient for someone trying to hide the fact that she falsified documents. It went on like that for hours, days. Every answer she gave was twisted, every piece of evidence questioned. The defense made her sound either incompetent or malicious, depending on which would be more damaging in that particular moment. But then the prosecution called their rebuttal witnesses. Martha Reed, calm and steady, testifying about the overcharges she'd discovered once she learned to read her own accounts. Anna Kowalski, quietly devastating as she described signing away her farm without understanding what she was doing. Eleanor Tate, explaining how the courthouse records confirmed everything Abigail had claimed. And finally, Thomas Chen, who'd done his own analysis of the store records after learning what Abigail had found. He'd been a bookkeeper in San Francisco before moving to Willow Bend, and his testimony carried weight the defense couldn't easily dismiss. I examined 5 years of the Doyle store's accounts, he said. The pattern is unmistakable. Small overcharges spread across multiple customers, carefully documented to avoid detection, always targeting people likely to have difficulty reading the records themselves. This wasn't incompetence or honest mistakes. This was systematic theft. And you're testifying to this because Miss Harper convinced you to? I'm testifying because I checked the numbers myself and found she was right. Chen's voice was firm. I have no personal stake in this beyond living in a community where people can trust that they're being charged fairly for their purchases. The trial lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of testimony, evidence, arguments, and counter-arguments. 6 weeks of Abigail watching her life and character dissected by lawyers who didn't care about truth, only victory. But in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Margaret Doyle was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Her husband Robert got 10 years. Their son Michael, who'd been less involved, got 5 years and a massive fine. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years, depending on their level of participation. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Some people cheered, others wept, whether from relief or grief, Abigail couldn't tell. Margaret herself sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. As the deputies led her away, she turned to look at Abigail one last time. No words this time, just a look that promised this wasn't over, that even from prison she'd find ways to make Abigail's life difficult. But Abigail had stopped being afraid of Margaret Doyle's threats. The woman had taken her best shot and failed. Everything else was just noise. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They wanted statements, reactions, dramatic quotes about justice being served. Abigail pushed through them without speaking, too exhausted for performance. Marshal Reeve caught up with her at the edge of the crowd. "You did it. You actually took down the network." "We did it. All of us." "Maybe, but you're the one who started it, the one who refused to back down even when backing down would have been safer." He extended his hand. "On behalf of the territorial government, thank you. And if you ever want a job as an investigator, let me know. We could use someone with your instincts." Abigail shook his hand but laughed at the offer. I think I've had enough of investigating corruption. I'd rather prevent it from happening in the first place. Fair enough. Good luck with that. Caleb was waiting with the wagon, having stayed quiet during the media chaos. As they drove away from the courthouse, Abigail finally let herself feel the weight of the last 6 months. It's over, she said, mostly to herself. The trial's over, but you've got decisions to make now. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. That job offer's still waiting, and I've put a deposit on office space in Denver. 2 rooms above a dry goods store, good light, close to the courthouse for when you need to file paperwork. You rented office space without asking me? I rented it with the option to cancel if you decide you're not interested. But I figured if you were going to build systems to prevent corruption, you'd need somewhere to do it from. He glanced at her. Also got a contract to provide horses to 3 ranches near Denver. So I'll be in the area frequently, in case you need help. Or company. Or someone to make terrible coffee. Abigail felt tears threatening and blinked them back. You're very sure of yourself. I'm sure of you. The rest I'm making up as I go. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of town, turned to face her fully. I've asked you twice to think about a future together. You've told me to wait until after the trial both times. Well, the trial's over, so I'm asking a 3rd time, and this time I need an answer. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if you want to build something together. A literacy program, a ranch, a life. Whatever shape it takes, I want to be part of it. With you. As partners in every sense of the word. He took her hand, his voice going soft. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Abigail. Not because you need protecting or because I'm trying to save you, but because I love you and I think we could build something remarkable together. The proposal was so earnest, so Caleb, practical and direct and completely honest, that Abigail started laughing through her tears. That's not usually the response a man hopes for, he said, but he was smiling. Yes, Abigail said. Yes to the literacy program. Yes to Denver. Yes to building something together. Yes to all of it. And the marriage part? Especially the marriage part. She leaned across the wagon seat and kissed him, tasting snow and hope and a future that suddenly felt possible. You're the best decision I've made in this whole mess. I'll remind you of that when I burn dinner and leave my boots in the middle of the floor. They sat there for a moment. The wagon stopped on the road between Silver Creek and everywhere else, between the past they'd survived and the future they'd built. What happens now? Caleb asked eventually. Now we go back to Willow Bend. I accept that job offer. We start planning the literacy programs. Abigail felt energy returning, purpose crystallizing. And we make sure what happened there never happens again in any town we can reach. That's ambitious. I've never been very good at thinking small. No, Caleb agreed, snapping the reins to start the horses moving again. You really haven't. They returned to Willow Bend in early March, when the worst of winter had passed and the first signs of spring were appearing. The town was different, quieter in some ways, more open in others. The Doyle store had been sold to pay restitution to victims. The property Margaret had fraudulently acquired was being returned to families or sold with proceeds going to a victim fund. And the Carver Street building had been transformed. With funding from the territorial government and donations from guilty citizens who'd looked the other way for too long, it had been renovated into a proper schoolhouse. Martha Reed stood at the door the day it opened, greeting students with a smile that looked both proud and painful. She'd lost her barn and nearly lost her freedom, but she'd gained something too, the ability to read not just account books, but newspapers, legal documents, letters from her sister back east. Welcome to the Willow Bend Literacy Center, she announced to the gathered crowd, where every woman who wants to learn will have the chance, and no one will ever again sign away their property because they couldn't read what they were signing. The first students arrived tentatively. Some were the women Abigail had taught in secret, now able to learn openly. Others were new, younger women, a few men, even some children whose parents had decided literacy was more important than whatever social conventions said about who deserved education. Abigail watched from the back of the room as Martha led the first lesson. She'd hired Martha as the center's first teacher, along with Eleanor as an assistant. Both women had discovered they had a gift for teaching, a patience and understanding that came from knowing firsthand what it felt like to be denied knowledge. You're not teaching today? Caleb asked, appearing beside her with coffee because some things never changed. I'll teach eventually, but this needs to be theirs, not mine. They're the ones who stayed when staying was dangerous. They're the ones who testified even when it cost them. They deserve to be the face of what we're building. Over the next few months, they built steadily. The Willow Bend Center became a model for others across the territory. Abigail traveled to different towns, training teachers, setting up programs, connecting women who'd been isolated in their illiteracy with resources and community. And in Denver, true to his word, Caleb established the satellite ranch operation while Abigail set up the central office for the territorial literacy program. They worked side by side, partners in every sense, sometimes agreeing, often arguing, always pushing each other to think bigger and work harder. They married in June, a small ceremony in Willow Bend, with Martha and Eleanor standing as witnesses and half the town showing up despite not being formally invited. Judge Harrison officiated, looking pleased with himself. "I knew you'd end up doing something remarkable," he told Abigail afterward. "Though I'll admit, when you first marched into that church last summer, I thought you were either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Abigail admitted. "The best people usually are." He raised his glass in a toast to courage and foolishness, and to the stubborn belief that one person can make a difference. As the celebration continued around her, Abigail found herself thinking about that day in the street, kneeling in the dust while people laughed. She'd been so angry then, so humiliated, so certain her life was over. She couldn't have known that moment would be the beginning of everything. That the man who helped her gather her papers would become her husband. That the women she taught would become her colleagues and friends. That the corruption she uncovered would lead to systemic change across multiple territories. But looking back now, she understood something important. The moment they tried to break you was often the moment you discovered exactly how strong you could be. "You look thoughtful," Caleb said, pulling her out of her reverie. "Just remembering where we started." "Literally in the dirt, if I recall." "Literally in the dirt," she agreed. "And look where we ended up." "We're not ended up yet. We're just getting started." He took her hand, laced their fingers together. 20 more towns need literacy centers. The territorial governor wants to expand the program into neighboring territories. And I just got a letter from a women's advocacy group in Chicago asking if you'd consult on their literacy initiative. "That's too much. I can't possibly," says the woman who took on a criminal empire with nothing but copied ledgers and righteous fury. Caleb's smile was warm. "If anyone can do it, it's you." Abigail looked across the room at the women who'd stood with her. Martha, teaching classes 3 days a week and managing the Willow Bend Center. Eleanor, developing curriculum and training new teachers. Anna Kowalski, who'd gotten her farm back and was now volunteering to help other widows understand their legal rights. June Bell, Sarah Mendez, and a dozen others, all of them transformed from victims into advocates. They'd done more than expose corruption. They'd proved that ordinary women with knowledge and courage could challenge systems designed to keep them powerless. They'd shown that literacy wasn't just about reading words. It was about reading the world clearly enough to change it. "You're right," Abigail said finally. "We're just getting started." 2 years later, the Willow Bend Center celebrated its anniversary. 83 women had learned to read through the program. 12 had gone on to teach in other centers. 4 had successfully challenged fraudulent contracts they'd signed years earlier, recovering property or money they'd thought was lost forever. Margaret Doyle was still in prison, her appeals exhausted, her empire permanently dismantled. The criminal network she'd been part of had been broken up across 3 territories, resulting in 37 convictions and the recovery of over $300,000 in fraudulently obtained property. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the classroom, in the moment when a woman read her first contract and understood what she was signing. It was in the widow who checked her store account and caught an overcharge before it accumulated. It was in the mother who taught her daughter that knowledge was power, and power didn't belong exclusively to men or the wealthy. Abigail stood at the door of the Willow Bend Center, watching students arrive for the anniversary celebration. Some she recognized from those early secret lessons. Others were new, drawn by word of mouth about a place where women could learn without judgment. The truth was, she'd have been terrified that day in the street. Terrified and humiliated and convinced she'd lost everything that mattered. But what she'd actually lost was the illusion that keeping her head down would keep her safe. The belief that someone else would fix the broken systems if she just waited long enough. What she'd gained was infinitely more valuable. The understanding that power came not from controlling others, but from refusing to be controlled. That justice required not just exposure, but the patient, grinding work of building better systems. That one person with evidence and courage could start a movement, but it took a community to sustain it. Caleb appeared beside her, because that's what he did now, showed up exactly when she needed him, often before she realized she needed him. Big crowd tonight, he observed. Lots of people want to celebrate. They're celebrating you. They're celebrating themselves, their courage, their hard work, their refusal to accept that being cheated was just the cost of being a woman in a frontier town. Abigail leaned against him, comfortable in the partnership they'd built. I just opened a door. They're the ones who walked through it. You're terrible at taking credit. I'm good at understanding that lasting change requires more than one person being heroic. It requires systems and community and the belief that things can be different. Inside, Martha was calling everyone to attention for speeches and toasts. Abigail took a breath, preparing to join them, when a young woman approached hesitantly. Miss Harper? Mrs. Boone? Is fine. I'm Caroline Winters. I just moved to Willow Bend last month. My husband works at the new mill. She twisted her hands together nervously. I can't read, never learned. And I was wondering, is it too late to join the classes? Abigail felt something warm bloom in her chest. This was why they'd built it, not for the dramatic courtroom victories or the newspaper headlines. For this, a young woman asking if it was too late to learn and getting to hear the answer was no. It's never too late, Abigail said. Classes start Tuesday evening. Martha Reed is the lead teacher, and she's excellent. She'll make sure you get exactly what you need. Caroline's face lit up. Thank you. I've been so scared to ask, afraid people would think I was stupid. You're not stupid. You just haven't had the opportunity yet. That's different. Abigail squeezed the young woman's hand. And once you learn, you can help the next person who's afraid to ask. That's how we change things. One woman teaching another, building knowledge until it's too widespread to suppress. As Caroline hurried inside to sign up, Caleb pulled Abigail close. You know what I love about you? He said quietly. My sparkling personality. That too, but mostly I love that you genuinely believe one woman at a time, one lesson at a time, we can remake the world. And then you go out and prove it. We prove it, together. Together, he agreed. They joined the celebration, surrounded by women who'd learned to read their own stories and decided to write new endings. Women who'd been told they were too simple, too emotional, too female to understand complex things like numbers and contracts. Women who'd proved that wrong one ledger entry at a time. The road from that dusty street to this moment had been long and brutal. Abigail had lost her job, her reputation, her sense of safety. She'd been threatened, arrested, publicly humiliated. She'd watched good people suffer for standing with her. But she'd also discovered that the things she thought she'd lost, security, respectability, the approval of powerful people, had never actually been hers to begin with. They'd been conditional, dependent on her staying quiet and small and grateful for whatever scraps the powerful chose to throw her. What she'd gained was something no one could take away. The knowledge that she was strong enough to stand up, smart enough to build systems, stubborn enough to keep fighting even when fighting seemed hopeless. And she'd gained a community of women who'd learned the same thing about themselves. As the celebration continued late into the night, Abigail stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The street where she'd knelt gathering scattered papers was peaceful now, empty except for the glow of lamplight from the center's windows. She thought about the woman she'd been then, angry and scared and certain she had to do everything alone. And she thought about the woman she'd become, still angry when anger was warranted, still scared when the stakes were high, but no longer alone. Never alone again. Because that was the thing about power they didn't teach you. It wasn't about dominance or control. It was about connection, about building networks of people who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. It was about the slow, patient work of teaching one woman to read, then another, until literacy became contagious and ignorance could no longer be weaponized. The powerful wanted you to believe you were small, that your voice didn't matter, that standing up would only get you crushed. They wanted you scared and silent and convinced that fighting back was hopeless. But Abigail Harper had knelt in the dust and stood back up. She'd faced down an empire built on exploitation and won. Not because she was special or uniquely brave, but because she'd refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. And in the end, that refusal, that stubborn, fierce, absolutely unreasonable refusal to surrender, had changed everything. Inside, the celebration was winding down. Women hugged goodbye, made plans for next week's classes, promised to bring friends who needed to learn. Martha caught Abigail's eye across the room and raised her glass in a silent toast. To the women who refused to break. To the ones who stood back up. To the stubborn belief that knowledge was power and power belonged to everyone who had the courage to claim it. Caleb appeared with their coats. Ready to go home? Abigail took one last look at the center, at the evidence of what they'd built together. Then she took her husband's hand and smiled. Yes, let's go home. They walked together into the spring night, leaving behind the schoolhouse that had once been a battlefield and was now a beacon. Leaving behind the town that had tried to destroy one woman and ended up transforming itself instead. Behind them, the lights of the Willow Bend Literacy Center burned bright, a promise that somewhere in that building, another woman was learning to read her first contract, check her first account, understand her first legal document. Another woman was discovering that she'd never been stupid, just denied. That she'd never been helpless, just kept ignorant. That the moment you taught someone to read was the moment you gave them power no one could ever take away. And that was the real victory. Not the courtroom drama, or the newspaper headlines. Not even the satisfaction of watching corrupt people face justice. The real victory was in the quiet transformation of ordinary women into architects of their own futures, in the accumulation of small acts of courage until they added up to revolution. Abigail Harper had started out just trying to help a few widows check their store accounts. She'd ended up changing the way an entire territory thought about literacy, justice, and who deserved power. And she'd learned something that would stay with her forever. The moment they tried to break you was often the exact moment you discovered you were unbreakable. All you had to do was stand back up,